you can't out-science hard training. You've got to do the work if you want to get the results. Your body is so made to move against stuff that if you don't do that, you are drastically accelerating your aging and your cognitive decline as well. I don't think seed oils are innocuous from the perspective that in the last few decades, added oils are one of the biggest source of increased energy in the American diet. You carnivores would lose your absolute minds if anybody dared suggest that it wasn't good for you. And so it just very clearly points out the asymmetrical application of logic.
Hey everyone, I'm sitting here with Dr. Layne Norton, who needs no intro. He is a scientist. He has a Ph.D. in nutrition. He is a fitness industry influencer. And he is also a natural professional bodybuilder, powerlifter. He's an author, serial entrepreneur. The list goes on. And I'm super excited to be sitting here today with you, Layne. You and I, we've had interactions over the years on social media, and it's a long time coming that we get to sit down together, meet each other, have a discussion. I have a lot of respect for the things that you put out on social media, on YouTube, the way you look at the evidence, and really in particular, your overall view of health and fitness and how practical of a view you take, evidence-based, and really just it's influenced me over the years. So I'll say that. So excited to have you here, Layne.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. And I think, we had quite a few conversations off camera about, I didn't start out like 10,000 foot view. I started down as a biochemist in the weeds, and thankfully just had a really great experience in graduate school where I had a PhD advisor who had the same background, BS in biochemistry, PhD in nutrition. His name's Don Layman, a legend in protein metabolism. And he just did a really great job of understanding the biochemical mechanisms, understanding how they fit together, but also understanding how did that look on a global level, what actually pans out in real life. And I just think I just got so lucky with that experience to be able to kind of synergize those things,
You also have this very unique background because you are a professional powerlifter, bodybuilder. You have been for many years. You're coaching people. You've coached thousands of people. In fact, I kind of wanted to start with, I'm interested in understanding what are some of the common themes that you use in your coaching to help people be successful? And what are some of, I would say, the misconceptions, the common misconceptions that you see you have to address in order for them to be successful?
I think if we zoom way out again, right? The people end up spending a lot of energy and time on stuff that just doesn't matter that much, instead of just really focusing on the big rocks, the big boulders, right? And one of the things, one of my favorite quotes is, the magic you're looking for is in the work you keep attempting to avoid, right? So for example, I did a post about red light therapy the other day, and the post was I didn't think it was negative towards red light therapy. It kind of said, hey, here's what it might do based on these research studies. Here's the limitations. But please keep in mind where this fits in the overall hierarchy of things. This is a very small piece of a puzzle compared to sleep, proper nutrition, exercise, and I think there can be so much stuff floating around in the fitness sphere, is that a way of saying it? That you and I, as having the background, we can pretty easily detangle what the kind of hierarchy of stuff is, where the most important stuff is. But I think for the average person, they hear these things and they don't really know how to slot those things into order, And I've found so many people really have an issue of paralysis by analysis of, I don't know where to start, so I'm just not going to start. And so a lot of what I do with my coaching, and less so now, I do less one-on-one coaching now. I have a team of people who work for me, is really just trying to get people out of their own way in terms of just saying hey, you don't have to be perfect. We just need to get you to start doing stuff. And yeah, you're going to screw up. You're going to make mistakes, but we are going to learn from those mistakes. We are going to see where your stumbling blocks are, and we're going to help remove those barriers to you being able to be consistent. Because at the end of the day, really, that is the biggest lever you have is consistency with nutrition and training. And we were talking yesterday on the phone, and I think a really good visual example was given by a guy on social media named Ben Carpenter, who's a dietitian. And he had 2 bowls of marbles. One was, I think, colored blue and one was colored green. And he said, if the blue bowl, I might mix up the colors, but if the blue bowl represents like highly processed junk food and the green bowl represents, good, whole, single ingredient foods, if somebody's diet is the bowl of all junk food and we take one marble from the bowl of, quote unquote, clean, good foods and put it in the other bowl, does it change the overall diet? And everybody say no, right? Like if you eat like junk most times, but you have one healthy meal, well, it's going to do very little, right? So why do we think it goes the opposite direction? Where like you have one unhealthy meal, all of a sudden you've just undone everything you've ever done, right? And so I try to meet people where they're at and get their mindset out of perfectionism and just get it into execution. I think that is the biggest stumbling block is we have a lot of people who just really are afraid to try and fail and just get into execution mode. And I think one of the most liberating things for me was that background in being a competitor and failing a lot. It just got me over the this is just part of it. And as from doing a Ph.D., I'm sure you had plenty of stuff that just didn't work. The number of experiments I came home with tears in my eyes because I couldn't even get the analysis to work. I spent probably a year and a half going through every step of our analysis of muscle protein synthesis because I wasn't getting any data back, trying to figure out where is the kink in this chain. For those who aren't familiar, muscle protein synthesis to do 50 samples probably takes you a week to get actual data back because you're grinding tissue frozen in liquid nitrogen and you've got to keep it under liquid nitrogen the whole time. Doing just 20 samples of that probably takes 4 hours. Then you've got to homogenize the tissue. Then you've got to separate it. You've got to take it through various reactions so you can get protein-bound amino acids versus intracellular amino acids because you need the precursor pool. And then you have got to take it through GCMS, but you have to do several reactions before that because it's got to be detectable in the GCMS. And so you go put all this work in, and then a week later you find out, it didn't actually do anything. Now we got to go back to square one, right? And so probably did that for 18 months, and it was actually a lab mate of mine who kind of figured out where the kink was. We had residual acid in the samples, but point being with all that, it was if I wasn't willing to go in and fail repeatedly, I never would have gotten to the answer, And I just think so many people are stuck in being so afraid to just go. And when I say fail, okay, you go out, you have a stressful day, you come home and you stuff your face with ice cream or something like that. Okay. Well, and I have a client I'm actually thinking of right now who was a hedge fund manager. And when we started working together, he was probably binge eating almost every day. And every time it happened, I said, okay, first of all, holding yourself accountable is good. Shaming yourself is not going to facilitate behavior change. Okay. Because it makes you so sensitive to the behavior that anytime you get close to it, you're just going to be black or white, all or nothing. So, and then I said, okay, what's the antecedent to this? Okay, you had a stressful day at work, you get home, there's not foods readily available that would be more conducive to your goals. So I was like, okay, hey man, not everybody's like this, but I'm like, you have means, meal prep service, right? I'm not saying you have to eat these every meal, but at least having them available. So if you're home, you're hungry, you have this available. And then he would end up night eating as well. So I said, okay, lock your bedroom door on the inside so that when you're going out to the kitchen, you have to unlock it and then put a little, lock. Put a little lock on the fridge or something like that, or whatever you tend to get into. Of course, it's not going to keep you out, but a lot of times those behaviors, a lot of people like to think that their behaviors are all choices, and it's not. We're on autopilot for so many things. And just that moment of mindfulness of having to actually like enter in a code or something like that, sometimes that's a game changer for people. And I even said to him, hey, if you have a stressful day at work, when you're driving on your way home, say out loud, man, I just had a stressful day. This would be a situation where I'd be more likely to binge eat. Just identifying it is going to drastically reduce the risk that's going to happen. So over time, this guy, over the course of a year, I think he lost like 35, 40 pounds. And he got to the point where he was binging maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks. But he would still get really hard on himself about that 2 or 3 weeks, or that interval. And I said, hey man, like, look at how far you've come. Don't let perfection be the enemy of really good. Like this, if I showed you a snapshot of where you're at now versus where you were, and I said, this is where you're going to be in 9 months, my guess is you would have taken that all day, every day. You know what I mean? And I said, listen, everybody has something they struggle with. May not be binge eating. Some people struggle with, alcohol moderation or gambling or, pick your poison. The likelihood that the inclination for just like the impulse for that to go away, very unlikely. You're probably going to always deal with a little bit of that impulse, but learning tools to manage that, that's where it's at. And I think so many people are really hard on themselves. That not only are they hard on themselves about the behavior, but they're hard on themselves for even having the thought, And so again, I really just try to meet people where they're at and try to just get them into execution mode. One thing I do say to people is like, Rhonda, if I said to you, I want you to go become the best 3-point shooter you can be. Okay. Now you can't get any instruction, can't even watch YouTube videos. But if all you did every single day for 10 years was go outside and shoot 3-pointers for 2 hours, you're not going to the NBA, but I bet you'd be pretty darn good at 3-pointers. You know what I mean? And just understanding that, you realize it is the mass action that makes the difference. And so I just try to remove those barriers for people to just go and start executing.
What about there's, you're talking about eating like the whole foods versus the processed and junk food and bad stuff. What about people that are coming to you that are, there's so many different diets that are, fad diets for weight loss. And, like if someone does they want to lose weight, they want to, increase their lean body mass and maybe body recomposition. And I know we're going to talk about training and stuff, but like, is there like a calorie amount that you sort of start with? Is it based on their body weight? Like, is that something, or do you like think about the actual composition? Are they doing low carb? Are they doing high carb or low fat? Like, how do you approach that?
So the most important thing is calorie intake. Is it energy intake versus what you're expending? But how you get there is what's really important. People can kind of conflate a physical law of, thermodynamics with tracking calories. Those are not the same thing, right? Like I can say, like it's a rule. I don't think anybody disagree. If you want to save money, you got to earn more than you spend. But now keeping a budget can help facilitate that, but you don't have to keep a budget to save money. And just because you keep a budget doesn't mean you will save money, right? So I try to get people to understand and separate those two things. But yes, calories is the most important thing. But what I try to do is, one, figure out, okay, approximately what are they expending per day? And the best way, in my opinion, to do that is if they have been tracking, okay, what are you eating now? In general, what's your body weight doing, right? Because if they're logging relatively accurately and their body weight's not changing, I mean, you can put whatever you want into a calorie calculator, but that is their maintenance calories. That is their energy expenditure, right? And so I like to start there. And then if people haven't been doing that, one nice trick I like to do, as you know, when you monitor behavior changes. And we know this right even down to like photons, right? So I'll say, okay, if you don't know it, would you just do me a favor? Just track for the next 3 days. I don't want you to change anything. Don't change a single thing you're doing. In fact, if you're eating junk food or if you're eating what you think is too much, that's great. Then we have a bigger shovel, like your energy expenditure is higher than we thought. We have a big shovel to dig you out with, right? So please don't change anything. But what invariably happens is it's a very instructive experience for them because they'll start tracking and realize, oh man, I was eating a lot more than I thought because I was having a bowl of ice cream that I was thinking was a serving and it was 3. Or I always tell people, if you ever want to be disappointed, weigh out a serving of peanut butter. If you want to be depressed. Or they do track accurately, or they see what they're consuming and they change their behavior already because they're tracking, because they're monitoring, right? And I mean, if you look at studies, it's very consistent. People underreport their calorie intake by 30 to 50%. There's a very classic study in 1992, New England Journal of Medicine. They had people who self-reportedly were weight loss resistant. So these people claimed that they were eating 1,200 calories a day. They specifically wanted this population. And these were obese people. And they said they put them in metabolic ward. So they're tracking their energy expenditure in a metabolic chamber. And they know exactly what they're eating. And they even told them, like, we'll know if you're eating more than you say. And they also looked at lean mass, BMR, total energy expenditure. So what was really interesting, this was one of the first studies that showed that obese people didn't have slow metabolisms. And like at first, the first few decades of us trying to deal with the obesity crisis was us like looking on the metabolism side. They must have slow metabolisms, or we've got to increase metabolic rate. And now we know it's the appetite side that has a much stronger effect on body weight regulation. I mean, it's so funny when people say to me, well, I have a slow metabolism. That's why I want to take Ozempic. I'm like, well, if you have a slow metabolism, Ozempic's not going to help because it doesn't increase your metabolic rate. It is a very powerful appetite suppressant. So in this study, they looked at BMR, total energy expenditure, and found that basically people's lean body mass explained about 70 to 80% of the variance in BMR and total energy expenditure. You can almost draw like a straight line through it.
Can you explain that to people? Because I think it's important, right? Like, and that was kind of a follow-up question is like, well, where training comes into this picture, where muscle mass comes into this picture, and why?
Yeah.
How is that a really important like lever that you can pull to help people like body recomp, to help people lose fat?
Yeah, so lean mass, just to be clear, lean mass and skeletal muscle mass often get used interchangeably, and they're not. Lean mass is a relatively good proxy for skeletal muscle mass, but lean mass versus fat mass is a 2-compartment model. Like for DEXA, for example, you'll get fat mass. So literally all fatty tissues will go into a bucket, and then everything else goes into a bucket. So we're talking bones, skin, undigested food, fluid, like all that kind of stuff. But in general, adipose is it's not an inert tissue. We used to think it was an inert tissue. We know that's not the case anymore. But it has a very low energy expenditure relative to other lean tissues. And actually, skeletal muscle doesn't have a super high energy expenditure for a lean tissue. It's actually one of the slowest, if not the slowest. Like liver and gut tissues have a much higher metabolic rate. But your skeletal muscle is your biggest overall lean tissue, and I would argue your biggest organ. And so its effect, having an extra 10 pounds of skeletal muscle, because it's so much, it does have a profound effect on, your energy expenditure overall. So when they looked in this study, when they standardized for lean mass, they saw basically no difference, no statistical difference in anybody's metabolic rates or their total daily energy expenditure. And when they tracked their intake, what they found was they reported 1,200 calories a day, but on average, they were consuming about just over 1,800. And they also overreported their physical activity by 47%. Now, I think a lot of people will look at that and go, so that when I present that data, a lot of people get really upset because no one likes being called a liar. I don't think people are lying. I don't think that's what it is. I think we look at ourselves with rose-colored glasses, and we look at serving sizes, and we tend to just give ourselves a little more grace than we probably should, right? And even yesterday, I did a day of eating while I was traveling, and I showed I went out to lunch, I got a salad, grilled chicken. I said, can you put the dressing on the side, put the cheese on the side, right? And I just used a little bit of cheese. I used the dressing. And, but still, like, after I added everything up, I'm like, there's over 30 grams of fat in the salad. A lot of you guys would have the salad and think, oh, this is low calorie, right? No, the salad was 600 calories, you know? And so if you think, and then look at, you know, take, for example, like the Cheesecake Factory, you look at the salads are well over 1,000 calories. And so I think many people do think they're eating healthy and just don't really have a great understanding of how quickly energy can add up if you're not very mindful about it. So this study kind of put the kibosh on, and it's been supported by a lot of follow-up studies as well, showing whether type 2 diabetic, obese, non-obese, it basically boils down to lean mass, explains like 78% of the variance in metabolic rate. And then the rest of the variance in total energy expenditures is physical activity.
Can I ask you a question about the lean mass? Let's say, assuming a lot of that is skeletal muscle as well, right?
Sure.
So what about the fact that your skeletal muscle is also a big sink for glucose?
Yeah.
So how is that? Do you think you can't really ignore that aspect as well, right? I mean, in terms of the big picture you're talking about.
No. I tell people, like, exercise is one of the only things that you can do independent of weight loss that will improve all your health parameters, you know? And we, in Layman's lab, the amount of exercise you need to get massive benefits is such a small, like, I got in trouble because I called it a disgustingly small amount, but it really is. Like, there was a research study done looking at vigorous physical activity, not even continuous, but just like throughout the day, cumulative, 4 minutes vigorous activity per day reduced cancer risk by, I believe, 20%. Okay. And then if you got up to 10 minutes, I think it was 30%. Right. And so it's like, I'm sorry, you got 4 minutes, you know? And some people will say, well, it's a cohort study, XYZ. Yeah, but we have randomized control trials looking at very short bursts of exercise, seeing improvements in glucose metabolism, blood lipids, inflammation, and then now the cognitive stuff too. There was actually a recent randomized control trial where they took people with men with major depressive disorder or general anxiety disorder, and they had them do 2 25-minute sessions of resistance training a week. That's it. And it was for 8 weeks, and the improvements in major depressive disorder and general anxiety disorder, the effect size for major depressive disorder was 1.7. Now, for those who aren't familiar with effect sizes, 0.2 is a small effect size, 0.5 is a modest, and 0.8, anything above 0.8 is considered large. 1.7 is massive. And SSRIs fall between like 0.3 to 0.8. Like usually the best you see is about a 0.8, which again, I'll tell people, what I'm not saying is that we should just get rid of SSRIs and everybody exercise, because sometimes maybe somebody needs an SSRI just to get them out of bed so they'll actually go exercise. But like if we're looking at how powerful that lever is, it's amazing. And then you look at the effects on bone health, you look at the effects on just like mental health, cognition, even short-term exercise improves cognition. I think there was just a recent study showing that even an acute bout of exercise can improve. I think it was memory formation. I could be wrong. And so I think, again, one of the limiters is trying to meet people where they are is like, hey, you see me train for 2-3 hours a day, but that's because I'm trying to be the strongest person in the world in my weight class. You don't need to be doing that. Like even if you just go walk vigorously for 30 minutes in a day, you're killing it, you know, like, but of course I would recommend people resistance train because I think there are so many benefits with that. And it just doesn't take that much.
First of all, okay, I just want to say we are speaking the same language. Like all these intermittent, they're actually called the VILPA studies, and Marty Gabala was part of that. I had him on the podcast, talked about that research, and it was amazing that they had these fitness trackers, like you said, and it was like they went out and did these little short bursts of physical activity, and it had a profound effect, cumulative, right? I mean, so. How easy is it to do like 2 minutes of like, you know, sprinting up the stairs or whatever? I actually work out mostly for the brain benefits, by the way. Like, like if I don't get some form of exercise, whether it's resistance training or doing some more cardio, like I am not in a good space in my head. Like the rose-colored glasses are gone. I can see the negative in a lot of things, comparisons. I'm just in a bad mood. Like I am a very different person if I get exercise versus if I don't. And so if it's like, for me, exercise it's necessary. It is part of I wake up in the morning, like I brush my teeth. I have to do exercise. If I don't, then I'm, not in a good position.
And so I think what I'd like to point out in that is you have made it a habit as part of your lifestyle. That it's not, can I go exercise today? Do I have time for it? It's, no, this is on the top list of this is going to get done, right? Just like brushing your teeth, right? And I think one of the things that I really try to hone in on with people is try to get away from something having to feel good to get you to do it. Okay, like sometimes I love to train, but it doesn't feel good all the time. Like last week when I was out or 2 weeks ago when I was out in LA and I had long travel, I had missed a session because one of my podcasts ran really long. And so I was going to have to combine like a couple sessions and I hadn't slept well and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like sitting in the car like, come on, you can do this, you can do this. But for me, I just got very used to my feelings are going to fluctuate based on who knows what. And so I'm going to go in and do the things I know are conducive to me being in good health, regardless of how I feel about it. Because if you're waiting for it to feel good, I mean, feelings are like the wind. And if you're kind of basing how you act based on that, you're just floating around. I mean, do you feel motivated to brush your teeth? No, you do it because you know if you don't brush your teeth, they're going to go to crap, right? The same thing happens with your body if you don't exercise. And again, it doesn't have to be a bunch of exercise. But speaking of the cognitive benefits, I mean, I was diagnosed at age 6 with ADHD. And honestly, the more, like as I look back, just thinking about it now, the more I got into exercising consistently, the better my performance in school got. And like even now, even though I tell other people you don't need to train for 2 or 3 hours, I am such a hyperactive, brain going 1,000 miles an hour that if I didn't have that, my best friend tells me all the time, he's like, dude, I wouldn't want to see you if you couldn't train for 2 hours. He's like, I would not want to be around you. You'd be intolerable, So for me, I think, they say that the sport chooses the person, not the other way around, right? I think maybe subconsciously there was some of that I just like felt better overall and loved doing it, But for people out there who are struggling with it, whatever, listen, whether it's CrossFit, powerlifting, bodybuilding, just going to the gym, doing machines, I don't care. Like any of those are going to get you massive benefits relative to not doing anything. And actually there was another study that just got published. I just covered it. They did a randomized control trial. I think it was in a Nordic country. I want to say Denmark. And they had people over age 65 do a year of either high intensity resistance training, meaning they were getting them within a few reps of failure on each set, moderate intensity, which was like bodyweight stuff, bands. They were staying further away from failure, but they were doing some resistance, or no resistance training, but they were active. Like I think the average step count per day was like 9,500 in this cohort, which is actually pretty high. So these were active older people. So they did that, and then they had follow-up. They had follow-up at 1 year, and then 4 years late, and then 3 years after that. So 4 years total. And they actually looked at people who stopped resistance training for the 3 years after. They still had better strength, better lean mass, better cross-sectional area. Those, like, yes, they had less than their peak after they've been doing it for a year, but it had this protective effect against age-related decline and sarcopenia, because the other two groups, the moderate group kind of probably wasn't statistically powered enough to pick out some of the differences, but they declined significantly. Of course, the group that wasn't doing exercise declined significantly. And even the group that did that 1 year of resistance training, 4 years after they started, had less visceral fat too. So it's like, one of the things people will ask me is, I'm this age, am I too old to start? Or can I resistance train? Or I do this. Everybody, if your spinal cord works, you can resistance train and it's good for you. And in fact, right across the street, at University of Illinois, where I did my Ph.D. in the exercise phys department, they were doing a study in frail elderly. But basically, we're talking about people who had trouble like kind of standing up, you know. And they started, their progressive overload was they started them sitting down to a high chair and doing reps with that. After, I think it was 12 or 16 weeks, I can't recall the specific details of the study, they saw significant increases in lean mass, cross-sectional area, muscle quality, you know, it's imaged by an MRI. They got so much more functional. Some of them were able to squat down to like a chair like this and stand up, or even lower. And so I think resistance training has gotten this bad rap because a lot of people view it as this like really aesthetic, narcissistic thing because of bodybuilding. And yes, there is that component to it, but like your body is so made to move against stuff that if you don't do that, you are drastically accelerating your aging and your cognitive decline as well. Like it is pretty scary to see how quickly people, and just look at the research on people over age 65. If they fall and break something and go into the hospital, there's I don't know the exact statistic, but I think it's better than a 50% chance that they're dead within a year. Like it's a pretty scary statistic.
And there's the as Stu Phillips likes to call the disability threshold, right? Where it's like, okay, then one of those things happens, and you know, then another one, they start to add up,
and then they get an infection, and then
right, and then it's like all of a sudden they're not mobile anymore, you know, they're not independent anymore, and you're absolutely right. Those things do add up, and I do want to. There were some people that had some questions about aging as well. In you know, with everything you just said, obviously, it's doing something is important, and sometimes not obsessing over the perfectionist type of program to do and all that. But I'm gonna ask you some questions because people do ask these questions.
Sure.
You know, first and foremost, training for strength versus muscle mass. Mm-hmm. Is it like, do you train differently? Like, is there a different type of? Are there sets and the reps different? Do you think for training for mass versus strength?
Yeah. So the two are interrelated. All things being equal, if you have more contractile tissue, you'll be stronger, right? But strength is not just muscle mass. It's also neural drive. It is how many fibers can your motor neurons recruit. Like there's a lot of things. It's technique. A lot of things go into it. And strength is a specific skill if we're talking about strength as assessed by a 1 rep maximum, right? So if you take untrained people into a lab and you have them like work up to say a squat max, right? What you'll find a lot of times is somebody will just smoke something. You go up 5 kgs and they get stapled with it. And it's like, wait, what happened? Because they haven't practiced that skill and they don't know how to, one, they just don't know how to grind a rep and be uncomfortable. But two, as you go higher to a 1 rep max, you're recruiting more muscle fibers. Fibers tend to be recruited in order. There's some challenge to this research, but they tend to be recruited in order from smallest oxidative up to, you know, middling kind of hybrid fibers up to your glycolytic large, right? And so if you do high reps with low weight, you'll still eventually recruit those larger muscle fibers as you get close to fatigue. But if you're doing a 1 rep max and it's a true 1 rep max, you're having to get everything you possibly can, right? So it's a very specific skill. So when it comes to reps and sets for powerlifting, you do the number of sets let me go back. So let's talk about building muscle first because it'll help frame it better. What seems to be important for building muscle is a few things. The first is mechanical tension and understanding that mechanical tension is cumulative throughout reps and sets. So when I say mechanical tension, I think a lot of people misinterpret that as it's got to be heavy, you know, and I'm like, well, if you want max mechanical tension, just do the most eccentrically loaded exercise you can possibly do. That'll be the most mechanical tension for 1 rep. But it's really about what is the number of hard sets that you do. And by hard sets, I mean proximity to failure. Now, the research seems to suggest for muscular hypertrophy, you have to get within a few reps of failure to really maximize the response, but you probably don't need to go all the way to failure. And this is probably conflated by the fact that if you're always training to failure, especially compounds, your performance and the load you can use is going to drastically fall off. For example, if I did a 10 rep max set of squats, like my absolute best, I actually remember the set. I did 530 for 10 reps, I think, something like that in squat. After it was done, I had to lay down for 15 minutes. I couldn't move, like physically could not move. If you asked me to do that again, I might have gotten, 2 reps, something like that. And so if you're doing that big compound movements like that, it's going to be hard for you to actually get a lot of effective sets in because it's so fatiguing. Now, isolation stuff, a little bit different. Single joint movements, a little bit different. You can kind of push those a little bit harder, and actually probably should push those a little bit harder. One of the best descriptions I heard was intensity is the medicine. So hard sets close to failure is the medicine. The number of hard sets, or the volume, we'll call it, is the dosage. So we have several meta-analyses now and meta-regressions kind of suggesting that there's kind of a dose response between number of hard sets you do and muscular growth. I mean, we've even seen it like specifically in the triceps. There was a regression by James Krieger that even up to like 27 to 45 hard sets per week on triceps produced more muscle growth than I think like 15 to 25 sets per week, something like that. So now again, I want to couch that with you're going to get most of the benefit. If I am always looking at things like how can I be the most muscular, strongest human being I can? But for the average person, if you just want to grow some muscle, you don't have to do that many sets. But the point is, it does seem to be kind of a dose response.
How do you know I'm sorry, going, for someone that may not know what their failure is, like how do you identify close to failure? Like what's...
So, and that's actually where practically I think most people probably should train to failure at a certain point, because otherwise it's really hard to determine what failure is. And actually there are studies on this, and on average, intermediate and beginner lifters underestimate their repetitions they can achieve by about 5 to 6. So for example, in a study, they might have them say, like intra-set, say on their 8th rep, how many do you think you have left? 2. Okay. Then the next set, they yell at them, they blare music, they're like hyping them up, and they'll get 15 or they'll get, 15, 16 reps, right? And so I think a lot of people, if they've never trained to failure, they viewed failure as kind of like discomfort. And in fact, it's funny because I've had people say, well, and I'm going to get into this about the strength stuff, I almost never train to failure, especially on compounds. And say, well, I've had people say, you train like a wuss, you stop, I'm like, so, okay, so that set of 10 with 530 that took me out for weeks after that, to be honest. You're saying if I stop 2 reps short of the 10th rep, that was an easy set. I can tell you every single rep of that set was hard and felt uncomfortable. Okay. And so I think people, if they've never trained to failure, it probably is a useful experience to do with a spotter under conditions, like be smart, right? But I do think it is useful. Now, when it comes to bodybuilding and growing muscle, whether you train to failure or stop shy, similar effects. But you probably want to stop on compounds. And again, I'm guessing based on some of these meta-regressions. I could come out, I could be a little bit off, but I think I'll be pretty darn close. On compound lifts, big compound lifts, probably need to get within 2 to 3 reps of failure to get the maximum benefits. For isolation, probably 1 or 2. But for powerlifting, this is where it gets quite different. And again, there are bodybuilders who train to failure in every set and are very strong. There are powerlifters who are very strong who don't look super muscular. And so there's actually like some people in the scientific community who will say like things like muscle mass doesn't matter for strength. I think very strongly that they're incorrect. And there are people who will say, well, strength doesn't matter for hypertrophy. I think strongly that you're also probably incorrect. Okay. Because all things being equal, let's take somebody who wants to grow muscle. All things being equal, if they are stronger, they can create more mechanical tension. They can do the same reps with more weight. Okay. That's a bigger potential. Take somebody who's a powerlifter. All things being equal, if they have more muscle mass, they will be stronger. And, one of the things I tell people is, well, if muscle mass doesn't matter for powerlifting, then I'm just going to lose 40 pounds, drop down to, whatever weight class I need to hit world records. No, it matters. Mass moves mass. But I think people, for example, me, I held a world record squat for almost a year, hit 668 pounds in 2015 at IPF Worlds. And I've got good legs by most people's standards, but if you put me on a bodybuilding stage, I'll never have the best sets of leg on stage. And they'll see somebody who has really great legs who only squats 500 pounds. And the conclusion will be, okay, well, muscle mass doesn't matter for strength. No, because that person, for them, because I don't know what their motor neuron recruitment is like, I don't know all that kind of stuff, but all things being equal, if they have less muscle, they'd be weaker. If they had more muscle, they'd be stronger, right? So same thing for me. Now, when it comes to strength, the purest expression of strength is force, right? You have to produce force, and that's mass times acceleration. Actually, mass times acceleration squared, I think. Physics people, please check me on that one. But there's a mass component and there's a speed component to it. So you can move a given load with the same force as you move a heavy load. You'll just move it faster, right? So now if it's a heavy load, you can apply the same force, but it's going to move slower, right? So that we call this the strength velocity curve. So one of the things that my coach, Zach Robinson, really kind of pioneered talking about, and he came out of Mike Zordos' lab at FAU, was he said, a lot of powerlifters or people who are trying to build strength train with a lot of fatigue. They're training very close to failure. They're doing heavy sets. And that is one thing that's very important for strength. If you want to get better at a 1-rep max, you have to be doing sets with, heavy singles, doubles, triples, because that is a specific skill set. You need that to, one, learn how to grind hard reps, and two, just feel what heavy weight feels like and how to manage that under stress. So you need those sets, but then volume is also important for strength. There's quite a few studies that show that. But interestingly, I believe he did a meta-regression looking at hypertrophy, showing that proximity to failure kind of was linearly associated with more hypertrophy. So the closer you got to failure, the more hypertrophy you got. The strength regression didn't show that. It had no association with your proximity to failure. And so one of the things they said is, with strength, you're always managing kind of expression with fatigue. So if you're training heavy a lot and going close to failure, you're doing a very specific skill, but you're also inducing a lot of fatigue, which is going to reduce the amount of strength that you can express. Whereas the way we kind of train, or he trains me, is when I'm doing my compound, squat, bench press, deadlift, I'll do one set or maybe two sets of a heavy single, double, triple, maybe 4 reps. And then we'll do back-offs that are much lighter, but we're doing multiple sets of them as fast as we can, like the speed of the rep as fast as we can. And they've actually shown that you get better strength results not training to failure compared to training to failure. But you do have to do some heavy sets relatively close to failure. And it's probably because, like I said, failure it induces a lot of fatigue, and that's going to mask how much strength you can actually express when they test it. So in general, this is kind of minutia that a lot of people don't really need to worry about. I always tell people, I'm 90% sure that you're not training too hard. I'm almost sure of that, okay? There are people who do train too hard. There are people who overtrain themselves. There are people who put in so much fatigue that it's going to mask their results. But for the most part, most people, there's so many people I see online who think they're overtraining, and I'll look at their training and I'll be like, No, no, you're not overtraining. And if you are, you're not sleeping well or your nutrition's crap or something like that.
For people that are not powerlifters or even professional bodybuilders, what are, perhaps someone that would approach your coaching business or something like that, who are wanting to, they're wanting to gain some mass and function and strength, everything, not like a competitive level, but like, what would you say, like, how do you do exercise selection, like choosing a hack squat over a barbell squat, or doing a bench press over dumbbells? And then also, like, are there certain, like, if you were to, like, are there like the top 5 exercises for each muscle group that you would consider?
Okay, so this is where it's going to be a nice segue of us of talking about X's and O's versus practicality, right? So I realized within a couple years of coaching people that, the X's and O's aren't really what matters. It's just getting people to do this consistently, right? And so it took me longer to realize that for training, but it still applies. And what I mean by that is when it comes to exercise selection, for example, if I was putting together a program for somebody and they weren't going to compete as a powerlifter and they just wanted to grow some muscle, I probably wouldn't program barbell squats, only because it's a, relatively high fatigue exercise compared to something like a hack squat, which is still a compound. It requires less balance and learning. And the research shows very clearly now that machines produce as much hypertrophy as free weights. We used to have this like feeling that, oh no, you gotta barbell squat and you gotta, do these big compounds and that's what builds mass. And, we have the research to show that's not true. We have the practical examples to show it's not true, because Phil Heath won 7 Olympias, and I don't think I've ever seen the guy touch a free weight barbell. I'm sure he has, but for the most part, he trained with machines and built one of the greatest physiques of all time. And people might say, well, those guys are on drugs. Yeah, but all of them are on drugs. So if we see similar results with different training styles, I mean, those sorts of things are equal, right? And so the research supports that. So, but here's where practical segues with that. So I trained very heavy with free weight movements. And for me, it was the best exercises for growing muscle. And here's why. Because that other shit was boring to me. Like high reps with isolation stuff put me to sleep. But you load up a free weight barbell back squat, now all of a sudden I'm hyped up, I'm excited, I'm going to work harder at it, I'm going to be consistent at it. And so for me, even though training like a powerlifter is not maybe how you draw up on paper somebody to be best for hypertrophy, for me it was, because it got me excited about training legs 2-3 times a week to get in all that volume I needed to actually build that muscle. And I had a client one time who loved CrossFit. He loved CrossFit. He's like, I know it's not the best for building muscle. And I go, you know what? For you, it might be. Because, like, dude, you told me when you tried to do bodybuilding training that you hated it and you just stopped going to the gym. So we have to start with compliance first, right? Like, you can have the best program on paper, but if you're not actually going to go in and do it, like, it's not going to work, right? And so I worry about, for the average person, what gets them excited to go, what exercises do they enjoy that they have low pain with, right? And what will they execute consistently? Because within that, for growing muscle, the world is your oyster. Basically, the things that matter, because I kind of got off track, but mechanical tension, number of hard sets, and muscles at long lengths. Meaning there does seem to be quite a bit of research that even when you equalize for proximity to failure, if you aren't taking a muscle to a long length under tension, you're probably not maximizing the benefits of it. So if you look at research where they do partials of like the more contracted partial of a lift. So for example, if you're doing a squat, so doing full range of motion versus a half squat, right? You get more hypertrophy doing the full squat. And there's quite a few studies on this. But when they compare partials in a lengthened position, so say if you're just doing the bottom part of a squat in a partial, which by the way sounds horrible, compared to a full range of motion, you see similar hypertrophy. So it appears that putting tension on a muscle in a lengthened position is important. So those are kind of the three things I look at is, mechanical tension, number of hard sets, training at long muscle lengths. Within that, the world is pretty much your oyster as to how you do it. Now, I will say I was in the camp for a long time of this whole, you can't grow regional portions of muscle based on how you do exercises. Well, that was one that bro science might have been right on. It looks like I was wrong on, right? Because there was actually, there was a study that just came out looking at, I think, leg press versus leg extensions. And they showed that leg extensions preferably activated the rectus femoris, so kind of that the middle part of your quad. I think I got the muscle right. And then the leg press preferably grew the vastus lateralis. So you probably want to do both, right? Because there's some people out there that say, all you need is the compounds. You don't need to do any isolation. Well, if you want to get the most out of your regional growth, it's probably good to mix it up. And I think, again, something I changed my mind on. About 10 years ago, I was very big on daily undulating periodization, which is basically you're changing up your rep schemes workout to workout, right? Maybe if you're doing squats, you might do day 1 sets of 10, day 2 sets of 7, day 3 sets of 4, and by 1, 2, 3, I mean just your squat days. And I thought that the research suggested that was going to be better than just doing straight sets or linear periodization. And turns out it doesn't seem like it really matters. But what I will tell people is practically it might matter because people do well with variety. I mean, you know this about dopamine and variety, right? And if you get a new workout, you get excited about it, right? It's funny, as a scientist, I have a hard time getting myself placeboed, which is actually really annoying because placebo's great. But even now, whenever my coach sends a new training block, there's a little bit of I get a little bit excited. So I think variety is important because if you're just doing the same thing over and over, it's too easy to fall into, well, I do this weight for this many reps for this many sets, and you stop progressively overloading. Whereas when you change it up a little bit, now you have a little bit more motivation to kind of, not settle into a normal routine. But that can go too far too. I see people change their workout up every single session, and I'm like, you're not actually getting as many benefits as you could because you're not getting used to an exercise for a certain number of reps, which allows you to get stronger, more mechanical tension, probably grow more muscle over time. So when it comes to people who aren't going to compete in bodybuilding, aren't going to compete in powerlifting, mostly what I look at is hey, do you know if there's exercises that you really like and have access to? Is there anything that gives you pain? Is there anything that motivates you more? I know some people are like, I love high reps. I love the pump. I want to get, cool, let's do more high reps. Because again, when we look at equated sets in terms of proximity to failure, when they compare low load training, and I think even down to 40% of a 1 rep max versus high load training, they don't see differences in hypertrophy. Now, I could make a devil's advocate argument that perhaps those studies, because a lot of these studies are 8 to 10 weeks, maybe over time, somebody training with heavier loads might produce more hypertrophy because they'll get stronger. And so maybe by getting stronger, more mechanical tension. But, I can't really say that now based on the research. But even if it was a difference, it'd be pretty darn small, which for most people out there, I tell them, if you're just training hard, you're getting 95% of the way there. And I use this example because people will all the time send me videos of IFBB pro bodybuilders training. Look at how they're training. This isn't science-based. How can you explain this? I'm like, yeah, but they trained really hard for 20 years, every day, right? And so that mass action is going to wash out a lot of these little differences. And most of the people who worry about these little differences are never going to actually get to express them because they just don't train hard enough. And one of my favorite quotes was actually somebody said, you can't out-science hard training. You've got to do the work if you want to get the results.
It also, I've had this conversation a little bit of this conversation with Stu Phillips and Brad Schoenfeld about, training to failure, lifting heavy, and things that you've given some more details as well. But it's what's nice about it, what I like about it, is there are a lot of people, a lot of older adults, women that have been scared of lifting because of the oh no, I got to lift heavy and I'm going to injure myself. I might bulk up too much. I mean, we can talk about that, but it does give. Once I found out, it was you don't have to lift heavy. You just put the effort in, fatigue yourself. Now I'm lifting heavier too. But I started to get into even starting, that was my in, where it was okay, I don't have to do this scary thing. Although now I love it and I'm wanting to lift heavy, but.
Being strong is fun. Anybody who can lift heavy, I'll tell you, if you can lift heavy and you don't have pain, it's fun. I haven't come across one person yet who doesn't like loading up a big squat for them, hitting it, and doesn't get excited.
I did want to ask you one follow-up on the squat, hack squat versus a barbell squat.
Yep.
Now, in terms of, muscle growth, no difference.
It's going to be similar.
What about functional, function? Let's say an older adult, getting up out of their chair, being able to avoid the fall. Do you think it's the same?
It's hard to know because, one, it depends on how we define functional, right? How we test it. If we're talking about preventing falls, and that's a great point that you bring up because a lot of people get so focused on bone density, we don't want to break bones. Well, if they didn't fall in the first place, and by the way, the best thing you can do for bone density is lift weights. Anything you can do nutritionally pales in comparison as to what lifting weights does for bone density. It's a massive effect on bone density. So what I would say is probably all things being equal, the free weight will probably be better. I'm not aware of any data that actually assesses this. But if we have a 65-year-old woman who's never put a barbell on her back before, that's a big ask. Squats feel really weird if you've never done it before. Seeing a well-executed squat now, after having gone through it so much, and I'm sure you too, you realize, wow, that's actually a very technical lift. That is a thing of beauty to do that well. And so I think a lot of times, if I really wanted to get somebody doing that, I'm probably going to start with them doing a goblet squat or something like that, or to a box, or something that they can execute with relative confidence to start. Because if I just put them on a barbell squat, it's going to feel weird. Maybe their back hurts, whatever. But I mean, again, I look at that as I just want to get them back for more sessions. So if what they'll do is a hack squat or a leg press, hell yes. And then hopefully over time, we can walk them into some more complex stuff. But I'm totally good with people. And hey, if all they ever do is hack squats, they are still going to be eons better than somebody who's not doing anything at all, right? And even leg extensions, So yeah, don't let the enemy of good be perfection. And it's so funny. There's so many myths around lifting and heavy lifting. And I don't want somebody. What I will say is most people, if you progressively load correctly, lifting weights is going to reduce their pain. When you're older, you're going to have pain. Okay. My dad is sedentary. I love my dad. He's one of the most wonderful human beings I've ever met, but he doesn't lift, right? He has sciatica. He has more back pain than I do. I squat over 600 pounds. I deadlift over 700 pounds. And yeah, I get some aches and pains here and there, and I've dealt with some back issues. But you also got to keep in mind, when you're trying to be the strongest person in your weight category in the entire world for your age, the amount of training dose I need to make progress is going to be almost right next to what is going to overtrain me and increase my risk for acute injury. And so I've always got to walk that line very carefully. But in studies looking at lower back pain and lifting, they show it decreases lower back pain. Because one, you decrease your sensitivity to pain because you're progressively loading those tissues. Those tissues are one of the worst things you can do is to not load tissues because then they do get really sensitive to pain. And pain is a whole nother, that's another rabbit hole I went down there's so much woo around what causes pain, injury. We talked about this a little bit. But in general, if you lift weights when you get older, you'll still have some pain, but you'll be strong and less sensitive to that pain than somebody who doesn't.
This kind of leads to some of the questions that I was wanting to ask you about, again, when I say you are obviously an outlier. I mean, you're a professional powerlifter and bodybuilder, but generally speaking, like how do you coach people to, as much as they can prevent getting injuries, lower your risk, I would say.
Sure.
Lower your
Yeah.
risk of injuries.
That's the proper way to say it.
Yeah. And then also, like warm-ups, stretching. But then again, once you have an injury, like how do you push, like you were saying, pain, like you get better with lifting. So then how do you approach once you actually have an injury? Like what do you do? Or what do you coach people to do as well?
So I'm not a pain expert, but I've talked to a lot of pain experts. I've read a lot of the literature, and I have my own personal experience as well that lines up with the literature. And I will say, man, this is something I really changed my mind on for a long period of time. The stuff I thought reduced pain and injury versus what actually did was so different in the research literature. And honestly, discovering the biopsychosocial model of pain was a game changer for me. Because after I set that squat world record, I went through like 7 years of really bad back pain, hip pain, that pretty much prevented me from competing. I wasn't able to get back to Worlds until 2022 when I won, because 2015 I got a silver medal overall. And it was so the things that are big levers for, let's just take injury first, okay? One, big increases in volume, in training volume and load when you aren't prepared for it. So there's a lot of people out there who they'll get, let's do this challenge. Let's do this thing. Bad idea. If you are drastically increasing your volume or your load, that is one of the big risk factors for acute injury. Okay. So when we say progressively load, like even my coach, if training is going well and I'm getting much stronger, we don't jump up load very fast. We're still only increasing, 5-10 pounds a week, because we know it's possible that I get stronger faster than my overall recovery can tolerate, right? So we're careful about how we increase load. Putting the tissues in under stress progressively is a big injury reducing factor. So, and now I was actually watching Quarterback on Netflix, which followed a few different quarterbacks. They're following Patrick Mahomes. And one of the things I did like that they were doing was his trainer was saying, we put him in a lot of different positions under stress and load over time so that the first time his tissues deal with this is not in the middle of the game. And so a lot of people think, for example, like form is really important for injury prevention. There's not a lot of research that actually backs that up, to be honest. Like take round back deadlifting. There was a study, I think it was a meta-analysis, looking at rounded back deadlifting versus straight back deadlifting, or degrees of flexion in the disc. And I mean, everybody would think, okay, round back deadlifting, it raises your risk of injury. And it didn't really. And you see some top powerlifters deadlift with a round back, mostly rounded in the upper back. And so you go, how is that possible? And then even like knee cave, knee valgus on a squat, right? That's where your knees come in. One of my friends is probably the best female squatter in the world, drug-free. She's squatted 496 pounds at 150 pounds body weight. Her name's Leah Bavois. She's a French national champion. But her knees cave when she squats. But she's always done it that way, which means she started out doing it that way when the load was light. Her tissues adapted to that, and it's not really a injury risk for her. And actually, I used to deadlift with a straight back and found that when I was fatigued, my back would start to round, and that's when I would get injured and have pain. And about 5 years ago, I changed. I said, okay, let's try this whole tissue adaptation thing and just pull the way I pull when I'm fatigued. Because if I'm training for powerlifting and trying to get stronger, I'm gonna have to train under fatigue. I've had way less back pain, and I don't think I've had any acute injuries on deadlift. And so
because I progressively
loaded those tissues. Now, I think all things being equal, if you can deadlift straight back, do that, right? But I think the idea that we need this like perfect form to prevent injury, actually the research shows people who believe they need really good form are actually more likely to have pain and get injured than people who believe that they're resilient and strong. And actually people who get injuries, mindset is actually a big factor for recovery. People who believe that they are strong and resilient recover faster from injuries and have less pain than people who believe that they're fragile. And this gets into the biopsychosocial model. So the other big levers for injury risk are psychological stress. That is a massive, massive lever for acute injury and overall pain. So if you look at fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, in fact, a lot of autoimmune disorders are very tightly associated with psychological stress and psychiatric disorders, IBS as well. And they show, there's this really classical pain study. I think they did a skin pressure test. And they standardized the pressure. And they had people rate it 0 to 100. 0 being absolutely no pain whatsoever, didn't feel anything. 100 being most painful thing they've ever felt. And the average was I think it was around a 50. But the spread was 4 to 96, if I recall correctly. So for somebody, it didn't even hardly register. For another person, it was almost the most painful thing they'd ever experienced. So pain is not what we thought it was, which is your body's a bag of meat hooked up to your brain. And if you poke the bag, cut the bag, burn the bag, cut the bag, your brain sends a signal and goes, owie. And now we know what happens in the mind affects the body and what happens in the body affects the mind. I mean, go in the opposite direction. Look at the exercise studies on cognition, on depression. So what happens in the body affects the mind. And it goes the other way as well. So psychological stress, that by far is the single biggest thing I changed in my life that got me into a low enough pain state to actually get competitive again in powerlifting. And that started with getting better at stress management techniques, going to therapy, started doing hard work of setting boundaries with people in my life, and even left a very stressful relationship. And I'll never forget this light bulb moment. And again, I'm not saying a negative thing about this person. It was stressful for her too, right? It was not a good match overall. It was a very toxic dynamic. And 2 weeks after leaving that relationship, I'm like, what is happening? Because I was physically noticeably stronger in the gym. And I was even sleeping a little bit less. And I kind of realized, wow, I'm not walking on eggshells all the time. My body isn't I'm not tensed up all the time. And this is backed up by the research that there is a physical toll that psychological stress takes. And so managing that has been huge. In fact, I joke with people that I have become much more zen, not because it improved the quality of my life. It improved my lifting. So I became even more zen, which improved the quality of my life, which then had a positive kind of effect on everything, right? And the other thing is sleep. So sleep is a big, big lever for acute injury and for pain management. So there was a study in, I think, Army, where they looked at 4 hours of sleep a night versus 8 hours of sleep a night. So people either had to get, I think it was 4 versus 8. And I forget the duration. I think it was 2 or 3 months. And they found that people who were sleeping 4 hours a night had a 236% increased risk of acute injury versus people who slept 8 hours a night. That's a massive difference. And people who sleep more have less pain. And you can just bundle it up all into that kind of stress management. The long story is it is about your overall recovery status and psychological stress, your beliefs about pain, your sleep, all that stuff impacts it. Now, when you have an injury and you have pain, we've all, not all, but a lot of us have gone to the doctor and they've been like, okay, that squat gave you an owie. Don't ever do those again. But you have to understand a lot of doctors, especially GPs, are not trained in modern pain science, and they're thinking about liability. If they tell you, you can go back in and squat again, You just need to like start off slow and manage your pain status accordingly. And if it flares up, back off on your volume. Because if somebody goes back in and gets another owie, they go, well, that doctor told me to go squat. I'm going to sue him now, right? So a lot of doctors are thinking about just minimizing their risk for litigation. But there's something called exposure therapy, which was the other game changer for me. So to explain it, let's take it from I'm sure you've heard of exposure therapy for psychology, right? So for example, if I had a fear of spiders, if you just take me and stick me in a room with a bunch of spiders, that's not exposure therapy. That's traumatic and it's going to make it worse, right? That's if you have pain and let's say, for example, I dealt with back pain that was triggered by me squatting below parallel and then having a fast and then accelerating the lockout. Okay. So it was only at the top and it was after I squatted below parallel. So it was very specific pain. If I went in and tried to do heavy squats, it's just going to strengthen that pain while I'm pain sensitive. But what you probably should do is exposure therapy. So that heavy squat, that's like sticking me in a room with spiders, right? It's traumatic. But if you wanted to manage somebody's fear of spiders, maybe you put them in a room with a spider that's under a glass case and they just sit there with the spider. And then over time, they bring it closer. Over time, they take the case off. Over time, you get better at managing that. Pain is kind of the same way. So when I dealt with this, so I was dealing with that as well as hip pain that prevented me from really doing any kind of heavy squats. And so I went in the gym one day after reading about exposure therapy and I said, okay, is there a squat variation that I can do that's low enough pain that I can touch it without it getting worse? Because the research shows if you're recovering from an injury, first off, you have to get the initial high pain sensitivity under control. And so that may involve rest and just walking or active recovery. But once it's under control enough, you kind of want to touch the pain without doing enough to make it worse. And the more you do this, the better you get at kind of knowing when to walk that line. And so I found, okay, I can't do a full squat with my normal velocity, but I can do a slow tempo squat to a pin that's about 6 inches above parallel, and then do a pause and do a controlled ascent. And I can do that, and that seems to be okay. So I started there. And every week, if I could, if I felt okay, I'd take the pin down, or I'd increase the weight, or I'd increase the velocity. I pulled one of those levers or a few of them. And it wasn't linear. There were some weeks where I had to kind of just stay the same because I could feel that I was a little bit more pain sensitive. But after 16 weeks, I was back squatting below parallel with not no pain, but a manageable amount of pain. And then over time of managing that correctly, I got to no pain, right? And so that was such a big game changer for me. And it really made me think about, man, everybody thinks if you got pain, it means there's something wrong. You're going to make something worse. There's a tissue injury. And the research doesn't necessarily support that. Yes, tissue injuries tend to cause pain, but soft tissue injuries heal within 6 to 12 months. If you're still having pain after that, it's because your brain has actually made a connection. And if you think about the purpose of pain, it's kind of a warning sign, right? It's signaling, hey, danger, danger. So I notice when I'll get pain is one, almost like clockwork. If I get stressed out about something, this happened a few weeks ago. I was overwhelmed, and here comes my back pain, just rearing its ugly head. And the trigger for that, I've also found just learning that I don't have to stop doing what I'm doing. I just need to try and adjust it a little bit. So I had that a few weeks ago. So I'll go, okay, I'm going to stop above, just right above parallel. I'm going to do a slow tempo, and I'm going to slow down the ascent of my squat. And I was able to keep squatting, right? And now it's been getting better. I anticipate within a few weeks, I'll be kind of back to normal. And then again, before nationals this year, I was hitting a set of 590 for a triple on squats. And on the third rep, I felt my adductor tweak. And I was supposed to do back off sets after that. And I loaded my sets for back offs. And then I unloaded the entire bar. And I was like, I can't win nationals today. And this is 6 weeks out from nationals. But I went over to a belt squat and I'm like, okay, can I get in a position here? If you ever used a belt squat, you can play around a lot more with like your foot position and whatnot. Can I get in a position here where I can do a squat movement with, not aggravating it? I could. And then I found that like below parallel was aggravating for that. So I did a pin squat above parallel the next time I was in, some more belt squats. Within 3 weeks, I was back squatting below parallel with no pain. And again, I'm like, okay, pain, the idea that it's a tissue injury, maybe, but also maybe not. Sometimes it's your body trying to send you a signal saying, hey, our volume's getting pretty high and we're not recovered enough, like back off. And so I've learned to kind of take pain more take it as it comes and not put so much judgment behind it. And it has made such an enormous difference in my training. And I just, long story short, the best explanation I heard, I think it was from Sean Mackey when he was on Huberman's podcast. I think he said, pain is an experience and it's more like an emotion than it is what we would normally think of as like the old school brain connected to your body, that sort of thing. And so again, I've become big on what happens in the mind affects the body and what happens in the body affects the mind.
You mentioned a couple of things. I just want to ask you about one, the sleep, because, there are many times when there's some people that get chronic, like 4 hours of sleep. They're stressed, their work schedule, maybe they're like a new parent, whatever, but generally speaking, like let's say you are getting poor sleep because of something social or just an event, like it's not like a chronic thing forever, but like you even get a couple of poor nights of sleep. That's when I think that really you need to make sure you really do focus on getting a workout. Now, I don't mean go and run a marathon, but like go and like do a 20-minute interval or even 10-minute, whatever, something, How do you... So you said sleep is important for lowering the risk of injury,
sure,
generally speaking.
And pain, yep.
And pain, yes. But like if you're getting a poor night's sleep or a couple poor nights sleep, do you still think people should go and train, or is the risk for, let's say, injury with like resistance training, is it going to be significantly higher, or should you just go and lift some weights?
So I think everyone should auto-regulate their training regardless of whatever happens, okay? And so if you have a poor night's sleep and you come in and you're feeling like crap and it's not moving well, then reduce the load and adjust accordingly. But that set of squats, my best ever set of squats I hit, that 530 for 10, that was after a night where I literally slept nothing. But I had the approach of, well, I'm going to go in and just see how it feels. And if it feels bad, I'll reduce my target load and we'll just manage it. And I felt a little shaky. I felt like, I didn't feel great, but it was moving for whatever reason. And I think what people need to realize is when we talk about the risk of injury and sleep, it's like the bowl comparison I made, right? Like if you've been sleeping great overall and you have one bad night of sleep, I very much doubt it raises your risk of injury. It's more about what you're doing. Just like if you've been sleeping like crap, sleeping great one night is not going to, you're all recovered and everything's back to baseline. Like, no, that's not how that works. We know like sleep deficits are tough to make up, right? So I think it's fine to go train after a night of poor sleep. Just auto-regulate, right? If you feel worse. And I tell this, I actually, I've had clients, I've had to have them stop wearing wearables like Oura rings or watches or whatnot, because they end up noceboing themselves because, my battery is low, or like my body battery is low, or my HRV is messed up, and it's like, okay, well, maybe that'll have an impact, but you could just go test the thing, like you could just go do it. And so, and the same thing, people, talk about like for females, we kind of discussed this a little bit, like training for your cycle. There's really not a lot of evidence that you need to train differently for any phase of your cycle. But if you personally feel worse during a certain phase of your cycle or even a certain day, who cares if it's the cycle, if it's the sleep, if it's the hormone, who cares what it is? Reduce your load.
I like that term, the auto-regulate, because it's really applicable to so many different, situations like that people are in. But since you brought up the women, there's also a whole, class of women that are postmenopausal. And, some of them maybe perhaps haven't lifted weights before. They've noticed that even though they're eating the same calorie-wise, that as they hit menopause, for some reason, they're getting a little more belly fat without necessarily taking in more calories. Like, there's something that's happening that it's not the same. How do you approach that? Like, is it like, do they need to lift? Is that the secret sauce? Do they need to lift more if they are lifting and it's still kind of hard? Where the calories come into the picture as well. Again, like I said, even if they're already haven't really changed their calories, they just hit menopause and then, they get that sort of belly fat accumulating easier.
So again, where X's and O's meets practicality. If you look at the mechanistic stuff of like BMR, total energy expenditure, all the like hard metrics, they don't really change with menopause. So your BMR doesn't change. So I said total energy expenditure on average, but here's the thing. There's a lot of people who have sleep problems during menopause. Stress goes up. You probably don't feel as good, right, as your hormones change. And so one of the big buckets for energy expenditure is actually subconscious or unconscious physical activity, like spontaneous physical activity. People don't realize this. So if we think about total energy expenditure, so calories out, right? Everything you expend in the day. People equate that with metabolism. Well, metabolism is your BMR. That's basically the cost of keeping the lights on, right? Like that's the cost to run your organs when you're at rest. That is usually a pretty big chunk of your total energy expenditure. That's like 50 to 70% per day for most people. And then you have TEF, which is the amount of energy required to extract the energy out of food. That's usually a couple hundred calories per day. And then you have your physical activity, which people think about purely as exercise, but it's not. Physical activity can be broken up into two buckets, purposeful and non-purposeful, which exercise obviously falls into purposeful. Non-purposeful is also called NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is actually really modifiable. And if you don't feel as good, you're probably not going to move as much without even realizing it. And so just looking at the research literature, not in menopausal population, but let's take dieting, for example. So we know if you diet, lose like 10% of your body weight, it can decrease your BMR. We call that metabolic adaptation outside of what you would expect just based on the amount of mass you lose. So it's about, on average, like 15% decline in BMR. But 10% weight loss can also induce a 400 to 500 calorie decrease in NEAT per day. Now, let's take what that looks like practically. All right, so I'm about 210 pounds, and my BMR is about 2,000 calories a day. My total energy expenditure is about 3,400 calories a day. If I start doing a diet that's a 700 calorie deficit for me, so 2,700 calories per day on average, that's a good deficit. That's a healthy deficit. If I lose 10% of my body weight and my BMR declines by 20% or by 15%, that's 300 calories. And if my NEAT goes down by 400 calories, that's 700 calories total. What was a deficit is actually now maintenance for me. And so I think a lot of people conflate calorie deficits don't work with, they don't understand that, well, maybe you thought you were in a calorie deficit or what should have been a calorie deficit, but if you didn't lose weight, you weren't in a calorie deficit, at least sustained over time. And so that can feel very attacking for people. But again, the reality is like you're in menopause, you're sleeping worse, and people also, well, I'm still doing the same amount of exercise. Yeah, but if you're not spontaneously moving as much, and I don't know what it is about NEAT. People view it as like a personal attack when I say physical activity. No, this might as well be BMR because you can't control it. Like your subconscious physical. Now you can try to make up for it by doing more conscious physical activity. And also I want to be very clear. It's not like you lose 10% body weight and then everything falls off a cliff. This is a very progressive thing over time, right? But you knowing that, you can make up for it. So for example, you can do more exercise or you can do more steps during the day, that sort of thing. But when it comes to menopause, I think, and there is some evidence that like if you get like a really low in estrogen and you replace that, that can have an effect on energy expenditure, about 100 calories per day, something like that. And then there are hormones that do make a difference for energy expenditure, like thyroid hormone, right? If you're hypothyroid, it will reduce your BMR. But I think the biggest decline I've seen, like the biggest absolute max I've seen in the literature is like 25%, which is big as BMR, but it doesn't mean you can't get in a calorie deficit. You're not a perpetual motion machine that can create energy out of nothing. Like you have to, if you didn't lose weight or you didn't gain, or you gained weight, your body didn't create those carbons out of nowhere. Like they came from something, right? And I think the disconnect between energy, calories, people go, well, calories aren't even real. You can't see them. It is referring to the potential energy contained in the chemical bonds of food that is captured throughout the course of metabolism. And so what I always say is like, if you ingest carbons, your body does something with them, and we can track that. And if you are gaining weight, your body is not creating carbons out of nothing. It has to get them from somewhere. So all that to say, to come back to the menopause piece of it, it is the lifestyle changes that really make the difference. Trying to double down on sleep, trying to double down on stress management, and also exercise. It may not feel good, but it is going to drastically help you. And I've gotten in trouble for some of these sayings because, again, people will hear that and say, Layne's gaslighting menopausal women. He's saying that it's their fault. No, I think that these changes can happen without you realizing it. And again, your subconscious decrease in physical activity, that's a big lever that can happen without you even realizing it or having any control over it. And again, it's why I'm almost so pedantic about terms, because it makes a difference. As Jack Reacher says, details matter. And so people will say, I'm going to take the stairs today, get my NEAT up. That's not NEAT. That's exercise, because you're making a conscious decision to do it. And so this reduction in energy from NEAT, it's not something you can control. So I'm not saying it's your fault, but there are things, lifestyle interventions you can do to help correct for that.
Do you think that a postmenopausal woman that increases their volume of resistance training versus, let's say, getting on a Peloton and doing spin or, endurance, like, do you think there's a difference in helping compensate for some of those changes in their physical activity that they're not thinking about because you're getting more muscle mass, or does it?
I mean, I'm always going to encourage people to lift weights in some form or fashion, right? But again, it kind of goes back to like practicality. If they love spin and they hate lifting weights, well, spin's going to be better than nothing, right? But if I can get people to lift weights, definitely want them to lift weights. And I mean, the research shows relative to your starting lean mass, regardless of your age or sex, you can build the same amount of muscle. So what that means, people, just to put it practically, so there's studies showing that women build the same amount of men as a percentage of their starting lean mass. So what I mean by that is if your starting lean mass as a woman is 50 kilograms and my starting lean mass as a man is 70 kilograms, and we both resistance train, we both put on, let's say, 10% lean mass, the woman will gain 5 kilos, the man will gain 7. The man gained more absolute lean mass, but they both gained the same percentage of their starting lean mass. So the potential for growth is actually similar, again, as a percentage. And we actually see that even with like strength too, that women kind of as a starting percentage of the 1 rep max gain similar strength as men. In fact, it might be a little bit better, to be honest. But that also could be that women have a lower baseline because they're not on a population level lifting weights as much. And so in elderly, we see that too. as a percentage. Now, if you take somebody who's 70 years old and never lifted weights before, they're going to not have very much lean mass. But if they start, they'll still gain a similar amount as a percentage of their starting lean mass. Now, they're never going to get to the same peak that somebody who started when they're 20. But again, this is why I tell people the best time to start lifting weights is right now. Like if you have a spinal cord that works, start now. It is the best time. And even if you're 50, 60, 70, it's still going to do what it does. And it's going to have massive benefits.
It's never too late. What about there's a lot of people that are older adults, so let's say they're 65 or older, and maybe they are just starting out, and let's say they have joint issues. And I think you kind of address this with the pain, and I want to just confirm this. So, for these people, let's say that are older, they have joint issues, if they just start with lighter weights, just start, with the low exposure where they're just doing something and training and their muscles are adapting, their joints are adapting. Is that sort of the approach you would take with older adults?
Yeah, I'd probably start with lighter weights and also start with movements that don't cause them pain or cause them less pain, right? Like trying to find stuff that, whether it's exercises, tempos, range of motion, just getting it started. Because I know over time, as those tissues adapt, they're going to be able to do more and more complex movements. They're going to be able to push harder and harder. And that stuff's going to take care of itself. But if I'm just dogmatic about it, and I'm like, no, you're going to squat. And I, put a barbell on somebody's back the first time they come in and they're 60 years old and they have a horrible experience with it and it hurts, they're not going to come back, So again, that's kind of where meeting people where they are is really important. So yeah, I'm going to try and find exercises that are low pain, that they enjoy being relative. And then again, even when people are starting out, we talked about proximity to failure, I'm not taking somebody who's older close to failure the first time they lift weights. No way. That's going to be weeks down the road. But just lifting something is going to have such a massive difference compared to doing nothing that it really almost doesn't matter what you do when you start, as long as you start, as long as it's not such a low load that there's no discomfort whatsoever. And so that's kind of how I'm going to start with people is just let's get them in, let's have them not hate it, and then also see themselves get stronger pretty quickly. That is a really good motivator to get them to keep coming in, right? And so that's why, again, I don't want to change up exercises every week because I want them to be able to say, oh, wow, I added 10 pounds from last time. I added 2 more reps, and it was easier. And so I think practically you can take all the research we have on long muscle links and proximity, and you just throw that all out the window. The first time you get somebody in, it is about getting them to come back for the next one. That is where we got to start. And also setting appropriate expectations with people of, hey, you're going to notice you get stronger within a few weeks. You're going to notice this, but it's going to take time before you actually see a difference in your body. But within a few months, you're going to notice a difference in your functionality for sure. And so I think just starting there with people is really important because like you said, for whatever reason, people think either it's going to be a waste of time for them to lift weights or they're just going to blow up into this massive bodybuilder. And I'm like, when you get in a car, you don't worry about turning into a NASCAR driver, do you? And as somebody drug-free who spent 25 years, their entire adult life, trying to get as big and strong as possible in a t-shirt, I look like an athletic guy. I mean, I'm a big guy, but I don't look like some freak of nature, And that's with me training consistently hard for 25 years. And I always tell people, hey, if you're worried about getting too big, if you start to get too big, you could just back off. This isn't rocket science. Like I said, I worry about people training not hard enough. I don't worry about them training too hard. That is a pretty small subsection of people. Although we end up having selection bias because we're in this industry, which has a lot more people who do train too hard and, get too restrictive with their diets compared to the average person, right? So
I think this is a good segue too for, the other signal of increasing muscle mass that we talked a lot about, the mechanical tension and the training, which is the most
important
factor for not only just muscle mass and function, but like we were talking about brain, overall health, bone density, just the list goes on and on, right? Protein, right?
I think it's interesting because I'll tell people I'm a PhD in nutrition, and I will be the first to tell you training is way more important.
Yes.
Way more important.
Well, that's kind of, I wanted to get your thoughts on, so I have had, Stu Phillips and Luke Van Loon, Brett Schoenfeld. We've talked about protein requirements, talking about getting the biggest bang for your buck with your training, 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight. I know you've talked about that as well. Mm-hmm. I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on like, what do you think about like earning your protein? Like, so there is this sort of focus on protein intake right now. Like there's a lot of influencers talking about it. It's in the blogosphere, social media. And, but like, does someone need to focus on their protein intake as much if they're just sitting around not exercising, not training? What do you...
You could make an argument that's actually probably more important if you aren't training, but I would say like get training, right?
What do you mean? So like,
if you don't have the training lever to preserve lean mass and get some metabolic benefits, protein doesn't do it nearly as much, but it does help. And so, but it is a small lever compared to actual resistance training.
Does it help? Let's say, if you look at the NHANES studies and people on average, well, depending on their age, but like younger adults, let's say people that are like 40 and younger, they're getting on average about 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight.
Right.
Now, older adults, more like 1.2, but that's their average consumption. So do you still think focusing on the protein, knowing like I guess for older adults, but I'd love to hear what your take is.
So, and that's kind of like the lab I came out of, Don Lehman's lab. That was a big focus for us was older population. And if you look in young populations, one of the studies you sent me on protein distribution showed no difference in 30-year-old women, which doesn't really surprise me because when you're young, and even like 30 wouldn't be considered young, but young enough that you still have like the normal kind of translation initiation signaling, so the mTOR pathway. As you get older, I want to say the study, I think it was out of Rennie or Wolf's lab. I can't remember which one. This is like back in 2004. But they showed not only do you get a decreased sensitivity of that pathway, you actually get like less protein, less of the actual like mTOR and the machinery associated with protein synthesis. So the research basically showed you could restore a normal response of muscle protein synthesis, but you have to consume proportionally more protein. So I think really...
Are you talking about anabolic resistance in older adults? Okay.
Yeah. So I think when you're young, it still matters, but it matters less than when you get older. And the problem with that is it's kind of like going in both directions of older people have a lower anabolic sensitivity and they tend to consume less protein because it's more satiating. It's harder to chew in general, like if you're talking about animal proteins. And so people just kind of end up gravitating away from that. And that's also where you kind of start to see protein distribution probably matter a little bit more when you get into older age, where if you're getting, 3 meals where you're stimulating muscle protein synthesis versus, just one big meal, which most people eat about 65% of their protein at dinner in America. And well, what's the problem with that? Well, on a mechanistic level, there's not really a storage form for protein like we have for carbohydrate and fat. So fat, obviously you can store as much as you need in adipose. Carbohydrate, you've got liver glycogen, you got muscle glycogen, limited, but still a storage form. Protein, you have the free amino acid pool, but it's very, very, very small. It's not what I would consider a storage form of protein at all. And some people will say, well, skeletal muscle is a storage form of protein. That's like saying you build a house and it's a storage form of wood. Yeah, I guess you can tear the house down and get wood out of it, but that's not why you build the house, And so because of that, there appears to be kind of a maximal, new study out of Van Loon's lab has kind of challenged this, But in terms of muscle protein synthesis, it appears that, it kind of caps out at a certain level on a per meal basis. And so if you're older, let me back up. For younger people, 10 grams of protein probably still does stimulate protein synthesis. But as you get older, you probably need closer to 20, 30, maybe even 40 grams, depending on your own lean mass and the source of protein that you're consuming. But, it really, protein quality, distribution, that stuff matters more the lower your protein intake is overall. The more you consume on a daily basis, the less all that other stuff matters. Your daily intake is by far the biggest lever to pull. And so what I'll tell people is like, hey, if for whatever reason you can only get it in one meal and you can still get enough total protein, I don't think it's ideal, but it's better than not getting enough total protein, right? And I think some of the problems with this research literature as well is when you're looking at protein synthesis, you're only looking at one side of the equation. You're not looking at muscle protein degradation, which is really hard to measure. In fact, it's so hard to measure that protein researchers out there, please don't get too mad at me saying this because I was one of you. But we just kind of do this and we go la, 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 and we just kind of follow muscle protein synthesis because degradation is so hard to measure because if you're measuring synthesis, you're using an isotopic label and you're looking at incorporation into the tissue versus the precursor pool. And then you have a very simple calculation that you can come up with a rate. With degradation, it's much more difficult because you're looking at the dilution of that label from amino acids flexing out of a tissue, much more difficult to measure. And to my knowledge, it's almost impossible to measure synthesis, degradation, and it's very hard to measure those two at the same time. And it's hard to measure them when it's not in a steady state. So like if you add exercise, you add a meal, like now all of a sudden you're in a non-steady state, and it's much more difficult to measure. So all that being said, there may be effects on muscle protein degradation that make it where, okay, this explains why, protein distribution is less important than we previously thought. Because I was a big proponent of protein distribution, and I still think if you want to become the most muscular human you can possibly be, that getting multiple protein, high-quality protein feedings per day is probably superior to one or two. But do I think it makes a massive difference? No, I don't.
What about, have you seen Luc Van Loon's study, the overnight muscle protein synthesis, giving protein before bed and it's stimulating while you're sleeping, you're building protein and does that add something to
I tell people, okay, I'll tell you what I do. Okay. So it's this is you inject me with truth serum. What do I do? Because I want to do the best I can. Right. Because people ask about pre-training protein, post-training protein. Does it need to be right after? How's the timing? Here's what I'll tell people. Probably a good idea to have some protein when you wake up because you've been fasting for 8-10 hours. And so muscle protein synthesis will be depressed. We do know that. It's also probably a good idea to have protein before you train because it helps we've shown that protein before training helps with recovery and protein after training helps with recovery. But it's not this okay, you don't need to be having a protein shake right as you finish your last set and downing it. No. But it's probably a good idea to have a meal containing protein a couple, 1 to 2 hours before you lift or exercise. And it's probably a good idea to have it after you finish within a few hours. And so, yes, but your training will probably naturally fall between two meals like that anyway. You don't have to accelerate one or the other. And the reality is, if you're eating a meal an hour before you go train and you go train for an hour, those amino acids are still in your system for 4 or 5 hours after you originally had them, maybe even longer, depending on the source. So I eat 4 protein-containing meals a day. I eat breakfast, then I eat lunch. Usually I'll train in the middle of the afternoon because it's when I feel best. Then I'll eat dinner, within a couple hours of finishing training. And then I'll eat a meal before bed because, again, I'm going to be going 8-10 hours without consuming protein. And that's just kind of how I do it. Now, do I think, again, I'm trying to be the most muscular person I can possibly be. If you're just somebody who wants to build a little bit of muscle, just focus on getting enough total protein per day. And if you can divide it up a little bit better, fantastic, right? But that's probably the last 3 to 5%.
And what do you think that total protein per day is? Would you?
Yeah, so this is where I'll tell you what the literature says, and then I'll tell you if you injected me with true serum what I really think. So literature says, 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight. Most literature tops out around that 1.6 number. What I really think is I don't necessarily know if there's a top end of protein where you stop getting benefits, but I do think it just becomes so marginal that you can't pick it out, because with protein synthesis, it's actually a really insensitive measure. You're dealing with you are looking for small differences between small numbers. It is very difficult to pick out. And another difficult thing to look at, especially when they're looking at lean mass and protein intake, is if you do an 8-week study, I mean, it's not like somebody builds so much more lean mass, even if they're resistance training versus somebody not. I mean, yeah, you build a few kilos, but it's not like this massive, huge difference. And so I think a lot of times we just don't, it's hard to do really long randomized control trials. I always tell people when they say, why didn't they do it longer? Why weren't there more subjects? Money, money, money. And also, I think people have this view that there's just this group of random people just sitting around waiting to be chosen for research studies. And they're just don't have a life. And they just do that no, research subjects are me, you, people watching. They're normal people. And guess what happens when you try to control aspects of their daily life? They drop out of studies. One of my favorites is when people go, why didn't they do it in bodybuilders? Bodybuilders say this. And I go, because you guys suck as test subjects. Because let's say I want to do a protein study on bodybuilders. As soon as I randomize you guys to low protein, you're all going to drop out. If I do a high volume versus low volume study and I randomize people to low volume, they're going to drop out. It's almost impossible to do. Or you've got to pay people to do it. So anyways, if we look at some of the meta-regressions, if we look at the research on protein synthesis, and even Stu did a study years ago of egg albumin intake, 5, 10, 20, and 40 grams of egg albumin protein. And the take home was that the 20 grams maximized the response, and it was no different than 40 grams. Statistically, yes, but I think 40 grams was still 11% higher in rate of muscle protein synthesis. But I think there was 6 people per group, which again, when you're doing muscle protein synthesis in human, you are taking chunks of flesh out of people. You are having them lay around getting infused with amino acids for 5, 6. Van Loon's recent study was 12 hours. People are literally laying supine for 12 hours getting infused. Who wants to sign up for that? I'm not doing that, plus getting multiple chunks of flesh taken out. So it's really hard to get high numbers to do this.
You're bringing up what I think is a really important point, Layne, because, and particularly coming from you, who you do really look a lot at randomized controlled trials and the meta-analysis and evidence. But the reality is that, in many cases, they can be set up to fail from the beginning because they're underpowered, like you said, and we have this obsession with statistical significance. I mean, we had to do something, right? But at the end of the day, as you said, it's there's a trend, 11%. Maybe if we had 40 people instead of 6, probably we'd see, but then it comes down to then, okay, well, I like how you're speaking about it, where it's okay, well, this is what the evidence shows. Yeah. This is my truth serum. This is what I really think.
Yeah.
And I think that's important too, because, even people that are influencers that are interpreting studies, randomized controlled trials, we can be very harsh on the results. But at the end of the day, these randomized controlled trials were designed for drugs, right, where people don't have any of this in their system before the drug.
This is very black and white.
Very black
binary,
and white.
We see this go up 50% because they're doing this drug, whatever. Which is why whenever, people, when they do meta-analyses in nutrition and they're like, look, the quality of evidence was graded as low to moderate. I'm like, yeah, that's going to be every nutrition randomized control trial. Because one, you can't blind it effectively, right? You can't blind it to the person because they're going to know that they're eating less, say, animal protein products, right? But that doesn't mean that these are bad, right? It's just we have to understand the limitations of them. And I think where I get really, like, people know me for screaming, randomized control trials. Really, when I get like that is when somebody makes a claim and the randomized control trials actually show the opposite. That's when I'm like, come on, guys. You know what I mean? Like, you can't make that claim based on this because, okay, even if we don't necessarily believe these randomized control trials are perfect, they're going the opposite direction. So at minimum, it doesn't have an effect, and it probably has the opposite effect of what you're saying. It's like I saw something the other day of like, I'm going to come back to your protein question, but I saw something where it was like, don't take whey protein because it has NUE5GC, and that's going to increase your inflammation. Okay, does whey protein have NUE5GC? Maybe, I guess, maybe, sure, possible. Is there a pathway where NUE5GC increases inflammation? Sure. But what happens when we actually give people whey protein in randomized control trials? Oh, wait, it's either a neutral or positive effect on inflammation. So just because a pathway exists doesn't mean there's an outcome for it, right? But if there's an outcome, a pathway absolutely exists. But when you're dealing with outcomes, you're dealing with the summation of multiple, dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of biological pathways all summing up to that particular outcome. And so, sure, I like to use this example of aspirin. We know aspirin's an anticoagulant, but it also activates procoagulant pathways as well. But the overall effect is it's an anticoagulant. So we have to be very careful. And that's, as you've seen, there's a lot of content out there now that it's, well, this thing is in this food and it's going to cause this. And it's like, I mean, I saw something about cruciferous vegetables, right? Like, don't eat those because they have isocyanates and that's going to bind to iodine. That's going to lower your thyroid function and that's going to cause your metabolic rate to drop and you're going to gain weight. I'm like, wow, we kind of skipped over B, C, D, E, F, G and went from A to Z, didn't we? And that's a pathway. That's a biochemical mechanism. Does it all exist and is it all at least partially true? Yeah. But what happens in studies where we just have people eat more cruciferous vegetables? It doesn't impact their thyroid function at all, doesn't impact their metabolic rate, and if anything, they lose more weight from satiety. So obviously we can say, okay, well, that pathway exists, but it's obviously not a dominant pathway or even something that really makes a difference based on dosage and all these other things. So bringing it back to the protein question, you're familiar with an asymptote. So I think the response to protein is probably asymptotic. So you're going to get, and if you look at Stu's paper of the egg albumin, you're almost starting to see it. It's this curve going up where your initial 0 to 20 grams is a pretty steep climb, starting to kind of top out, but continues to go up. And so I think practically there was a meta-regression a few years ago that suggested up to 3.3 grams per kilogram of protein still has improved benefits, still has benefits for muscle protein synthesis and lean mass. But again, meta-regressions aren't perfect because you're kind of like extrapolating all these numbers that are in different kind of heterogeneous studies and you're trying to come up with a dose response. But I think based on what I know about protein synthesis, also what we saw with Luc Van Loon's recent study of 100 grams of protein after exercise, I think there's enough kind of smoke to suggest that, okay, you probably don't ever truly max out the benefits of protein on anabolism, but when you get up to that 1.6 or 2 grams per kilogram body weight, you're probably 98, 99% of the way there, right? And so the benefits going up more are so incremental, you're never going to be able to really pick them out in a study.
What about for people, two things. One, like endurance athletes, like really just training hard, like marathon runners. And then two, people that are in a caloric deficit, trying to lose body fat, does increasing their protein, I mean, I don't know, above 2, but above the 1.6 and maybe to the 2. Like, are there situations where increasing that protein does make a difference in?
Great question. And Eric Helms, a few years ago, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's a researcher in exercise science and nutrition in New Zealand. And he did a systematic review, and I think it was a meta-regression as well, showing that in a calorie deficit, possibly up to 3 grams per kilogram of lean mass, so different than body weight, right? But still higher than what we typically see. that up to, like, I think 3.1 grams per kilogram of lean mass had improvements in lean mass retention during a calorie deficit. So yes, there may be evidence that more protein is better in a calorie deficit. And for endurance athletes, this is where the segue of one of my favorite quotes is, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. What I mean by that is, you see better recovery from exercise with more protein in endurance athletes, up to about that 1.6 grams per kilogram. I think I saw one study that was like up to 1.8 saw a benefit as well. But when do you get to the point of where practically now, because you're consuming more protein, you're consuming less carbohydrates and fats, which are fueling your exercise. And so does performance start to drop off because of that? And so that's where that segue has to happen of, okay, we can keep packing more protein in here. And even for resistance training people, right? Okay, I might have some bodybuilders who say, well, 1% difference is the difference between winning the Olympia and finishing in last place. So I'm going to eat 1,000 grams of protein per day. I'm pulling out like a fake example that doesn't exist. But what I would say is, well, yeah, maybe you're getting a little bit more muscle protein synthesis, but your training is probably going to suck, right? Because you're not getting in carbohydrates, fats. You probably feel like crap. And so guess what? Training is the bigger lever. So you're better off taking some of that protein, allotting it towards carbohydrates and fats so that you actually feel fueled and can train hard versus just continuing to try to pump more protein in. So for me, I consume, so I'm probably I'm 94, 95 kilos. I consume like 230, 240 grams of protein per day. So I'm like probably like 2.5 grams around there, 2.5 grams per kilo of body weight. And then my lean mass is probably high 80s. So probably like 87, something like that. So I'm right just under that, like kind of 3 grams per kilogram of body weight. But again, like I'm concerned about like how do I build the most muscle possible? I think for the vast majority of people, 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is like 0.7 grams per pound, perfectly appropriate, and you're going to get the vast majority of protein by doing that. But for those meatheads out there, if you want to consume more protein, I'd say consume as much as you like up to the point where you still feel like you're getting enough carbohydrates and fats to be properly fueled for your resistance training sessions.
Okay, I want to kind of shift gears and talk about some hot topics, I guess, in the fitness and health world. Yeah, so starting with seed oils.
Oh boy.
And I do think that
this will be the most commented section of this podcast.
Well, it's an interesting one. I avoid them. Mm-hmm. I try to mostly avoid them. I mean, at home, olive oil is what I use for cooking, for everything. But I also think they've been overly demonized in the fitness and health world. So, and I know that many of our listeners that are listening, watching, have heard a lot of conflicting information about seed oils. But maybe you could start with just summarizing what seed oils are and why are they such a controversial topic?
Yeah, so seed oils are generally polyunsaturated fats, which means they have multiple double bonds, and versus monounsaturated fats like olive oil, which is a single double bond, or saturated fat like, say, butter, animal fats, typically saturated, where you have no double bonds. And let me start with this. I don't think seed oils are innocuous from the perspective that in the last few decades, added oils are one of the biggest source of increased energy in the American diet. And so I just want to set the stage appropriately as well, talking about levers. People will say, well, it can't just be the calories. Let me give you the data on calories right now. So people will say, no, it's 2,400, calories have actually gone down in the American diet. I've heard this argument. They're looking at self-reported data from people, which puts it at like 2,500 calories a day for Americans. The more accurate way to look at it is you look at the food production, you look at food waste, and you look at food availability, and you can calculate approximately how many calories per capita people are consuming. Okay, that is objective data. That's not, well, yesterday I think I had, I don't even remember what I had to eat yesterday. I mean, I can look at my app and I know, but if you ask me to recall it offhand, like, God, I don't really know. That data is over 3,500 calories a day on average per person. And the average person gets less than 20 minutes of physical activity per day. So yeah, I think like a big chunk of it is energy toxicity. Now, seed oils can contribute to that for sure, because even right down to like, hey, you have a salad? What does it take for a chef just to, put more oil on it? Or, if you've ever had a dish, I can approximately guesstimate like how much rice is on there, but how are you going to know how much oil somebody put in? Like, I mean, I guess it tastes a little bit slimier in your mouth, but good luck quantifying that, right? And then I think also seed oils are probably a proxy for poor overall diet quality because they are in a lot of processed foods. So the question to me, there's two questions. Practically, are they contributing to the health crisis? Yes. But is it for the reason that the really anti-seed oil people claim? And what's interesting about this anti-seed oil movement is I've noticed it's kind of popped up out of the low-carb carnivore sphere. And I've seen this progression over the years, which at first the kind of the low-carb, hardcore keto folks were carbs are bad, just blanket carbs are bad. And then over time, that kind of shifted to, well, we think it's refined sugar is what's, insulin. And then, I mean, we've had so many randomized control trials now and meta-analysis that kind of show that like sugar isn't good for you, but if you're equating energy, like, I mean, I have several meta-analysis to show that it doesn't affect inflammatory markers, doesn't affect blood glucose metabolism, as long as you're getting in the same total calories per day compared to other diets and substituting out different carbohydrate sources. So then it shifted to, and I think it coincides with, there's been a lot of low-carb people who also push for saturated fat to be healthy. Because, I think this is like confirmation bias. We like animal protein. We want saturated fat to be good for us because then we can justify more animal protein. And hey, listen, I always find it funny when people accuse me of bias on this because my research was funded by the National Dairy Council, the Egg Nutrition Center, and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. There is nobody with a stronger bias towards animal protein than me, right? And I can remember when I did a debate with a carnivore person one time, I said, never in a million years, I think I'd be on a podcast defending the virtues of plants, So I'm not saying that there isn't some benefits to animal protein. Everything's trade-offs. But if we look at the literature, if you say seed oils are uniquely deleterious to health, then you have to say saturated fat is uniquely deleterious to health. Because for every level of evidence for seed oils, there is stronger evidence for saturated fat to be deleterious on health. So mechanistically, we know saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol. We know LDL cholesterol penetrates the endothelium. We know LDL cholesterol is a causative risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Now we can argue about particle size and all that kind of stuff, but we know regardless of particle size, LDL can penetrate the endothelium and cause damage. Okay, mechanism, right? And then people say, well, inflammation. Okay, well, if we look at the studies where they just have people eat more polyunsaturated fats, sometimes you see an increase in inflammation, sometimes you don't. But if we look at the studies where they're substituting polyunsaturated fats in place of saturated fats, we see neutral or positive effects on inflammatory markers, blood glucose regulation, liver fat. In fact, one of the things I tell people is if you're worried about liver fat increase from fructose, you better be worried about saturated fat because they compared them straight up, equating calories, overfeeding fructose versus saturated fat. Saturated fat increased liver fat 70% more than fructose in a randomized control trial. So again, all right, you want to make the argument that seed oils are bad for you. You have to make the argument that saturated fat is bad for you too. And usually it's kind of the opposite where they're trying to push that, polyunsaturated fats are what's causing a lot of our health problems, when in reality, at every level of evidence, whether it's animal, mechanistic, human randomized control trials, or epidemiological, looking at polyunsaturated substituted for, or saturated substitute for polyunsaturated, it's either neutral or positive. I have yet to see one study where they really show the opposite. The one study that they'll cite is the Minnesota coronary experiment. And there was some strengths to that experiment. It was, they provided all the meals to participants, and they did either, they were controlling their intake, either high polyunsaturated fat diet or high saturated fat diet. And it was a randomized control trial for several years where they're looking at outcomes, like heart attacks and whatnot, which is great. Here's the downsides. When they reanalyzed that data with more modern statistics, they found that, really, there was no difference. But originally there was a claim that, okay, the polyunsaturated group was actually having more cardiac events than the other group. But here's the weaknesses of this study. One, this is back when hydrogenated oils and trans fats were very prevalent in the food supply, and those were considered polyunsaturated fats, and they were getting a lot of their polyunsaturated fats from that. This wasn't from canola oil. This wasn't from, some of these other oil. This was from
hydrogenated corn oil.
Literally probably some of the worst source of fat you can get. Like, you'll get no argument from me that trans fats are uniquely deleterious to health. You'll get no argument there. As bad, probably worse than saturated fat. So that's one major weakness. The other one is, yes, they were controlling their calories when they're inpatient, but these people were in and out of these facilities because they were psychiatric facilities. So what did they do beforehand? What did they do after? What did they do in between? It wasn't controlled. And you also have to consider 2 years is a long time for a randomized control trial. Actually, the overall study, I think, was 5 years, but the average length was 2 years of a person being in it. And I think the average age was like late 40s. How many people have heart attacks, even in bad health, in their late 40s? It's a pretty low number. And so how many people are going to have heart attacks in a 5-year time window? Probably pretty low. And if we think about like the mechanism, LDL cholesterol, that we think is why, saturated fat might be a bigger risk factor for heart disease. It is about lifetime exposure risk. And this is something I changed my mind on. When I got to grad school, I was very much of the opinion, well, it's more about the particle size, it's more about LDL to HDL ratio. I don't think LDL really matters that much. It's more about the overall. And then about 10 years later, here come all these Mendelian randomization studies, which basically look at people who naturally secrete more or less LDL, looking at lifetime exposure to LDL. And that is what matters, because a good example I like to use is investment. So Rhonda, if you and I do each invest the same amount of money in an investment, and I invest in something that gets 7% and you invest in something that gets 8%, if we look 2 years later, you'll have a little bit more money, but statistically probably not, right? But if we look 40 years later, you're going to have a lot more money than me. And so just looking at a sliver of time, this is where, yes, randomized control trials are the gold standard, but they also have limitations that we have to consider as well. And so these Mendelian randomization studies, when they came out, you look at the lifetime exposure to you can draw a straight line through it. You can literally draw a straight line through amount of LDL exposure throughout the course of someone's life and the risk for heart disease. So to me, I had to change my opinion on that. Now, I think I'm making a little bit of a leap from saturated fat to LDL, because there are some forms of saturated fat that don't raise LDL, like stearic acid doesn't appear to raise LDL. But overall, if you eat more saturated fat, you raise your LDL. We see this in the carnivore community. There's people like bragging about having LDL levels of 3, 4, 500 milligrams per deciliter. And it's like, this is going to get people killed. And I think where there gets to be a conflict here, I'll come back to seed oil. Sorry, I know I'm kind of going down the rabbit hole, is people might do a carnivore diet, lose 30, 40 pounds, their blood glucose regulation gets better, their HDL gets better, but their LDL goes through the roof. And they go,
number.
Yeah. And they go, but I'm so much healthier now. One, you don't feel heart disease until it's knocking on your door. And two, you may, on balance, overall, yes, be healthier than you were before, but you are not as healthy as if you'd gotten all those benefits and also not raised your LDL. You would be healthier having all those things and also your LDL lower. So that is, again, we have to be very careful when we talk about independent risk factors.
Can I interrupt for a second? Because you're talking about the Mendelian randomization studies, and I do want to talk about carnivore diets in a minute too. But I've heard a lot in that community. These studies that are cited, low LDL is actually a higher predictor of all-cause mortality and early
after
death.
age 65,
Right, but those studies that you were just talking about, to me, are the argument against that, because they're showing people with like a natural PCSK9, like when they're having a lower level of it, and they have naturally just lower levels of LDL throughout their life, they have a lower all-cause mortality. They have a lower cardiovascular-related mortality. And that, so to me, it's like, well, the low LDL because they got sick or old or whatever is causing their LDL to drop. It's a correlation.
That's a reverse causality issue, right? Like people who have higher LDL later in life, when it's like your risk of dying is much more related to wasting problems. People who have high LDL during cancer, you're looking at a proxy for just they're not malnourished. And I very much doubt that if we actually looked at the raw numbers of LDL, I'm not familiar with it, but I doubt we're talking about elderly people with like 250 levels of LDL. I bet we're talking about people who are LDL of like looking at levels, of 40 versus, 100 or 90, where like getting so far down, it's because they're so malnourished and they're wasting, right? And you got to be careful about picking out these transient levels of LDL, because we know LDL transiently, if you fast, your LDL can go up, because you're getting more efflux out of the liver. But like that overall, over the course of time, it goes down. So yeah, I think, again, a Mendelian randomization study is basically a lifetime randomized control trial. I mean, it is, for that, the highest quality of evidence that we have. And people will say, well, there's pleiotropy, whatever. Okay, nothing's perfect. But again, we have mechanism, penetrates the endothelium. We have animal studies showing a dose response. We have actually some human randomized control trials that do show an effect. And we have the cohort studies that show an effect when it's long enough and they use appropriate covariates. So we have all those things lining up, and we have the long-term randomized control trials. So I'm just like, I don't know what other kind of evidence you need to like convince you. Like there's just not any, like, I don't know what else we can give you, And so again, with the seed oil thing, if you were looking at just, yes, it adds calories, but is it independently increasing inflammation? Like if we're talking about actual polyunsaturated fats, like not trans fats, I mean, if you're overeating it, sure. But if you're replacing saturated fat with that, the evidence suggests it's neutral or positive. And so they're talking about a mechanism. Well, those double bonds can get oxidized and there can be X, Y, Z. Okay, but what happens when we just feed it to people? And then you're seeing. Now, some people have said, and we talked about this, like heating and reheating. It's probably not even like one-time heating. It's probably like multiple times heating. Depends on the smoke point, all that kind of stuff. But again, that's confounded by the fact that, okay, if you're heating and reheating, you're frying stuff. And fried food is a proxy for really poor diet quality. So again, is it the seed oils that they're frying it in, or is it the fact that these people just eat really poorly overall in these cohort studies who are eating a lot of fried foods?
Certainly in the cohort studies.
Yeah.
So the seed oils, so far, the randomized controlled trial evidence doesn't suggest it increases cardiovascular disease. Doesn't suggest it increases inflammatory biomarkers, at least in the randomized.
Not CRP or
CRP and some of the yeah. Now the heated versus the non-heated, and this is where I kind of think seed oils can be bad, and that it does have to do with what you said about cohort evidence is true, right? Because you're right, you can't know, are they just frying all this like terrible food, and there's too many confounders, right? There's too many confounders, but there are very few, 3 or 4 studies that have interestingly compared heating some seed oils. A lot of times it's safflower oil.
Yep.
They'll heat it or even do repeated heatings. Like once I did 20 and did not, and then made muffins, the same muffins.
Yep.
With either the, like, I thought it was a great study. The 20 times heated oil versus just the cool, like not heated oil. And the heated oils did increase inflammatory markers, and they increased oxidized LDL. And so, and like I said, too few studies really comparing just non-heated with heated.
Yeah.
Because essentially, a lot of those randomized controlled trials showing no effect on inflammation with seed oils, they were giving them pills that they weren't cooking the seed oil, right? They're just putting it in the pill. So I do think there's a strong possibility based on the very limited evidence so far that heated seed oils might cause more inflammation compared to consuming them, certainly in whole foods, but even just like putting it on a salad or I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So it's kind of like if we look at the priority of what's important, that's some of the last stuff I'm worried about, just because I'm like, again, most people are eating over 3,500 calories a day, doing less than 20 minutes of physical activity. Okay, let's get that under control first. And if you happen to be eating some seed oils while you're getting your calories down to, 2,500 a day, not really that worried about it, right? But, do I think it's a good idea to eat a lot of highly processed foods that have had seed oils that are heated and reheated? No, I don't think it's a good idea, but I don't.
We have options too, right? What about avocado oil or olive oil? Do you think that maybe just getting one of those options?
There was one really big cohort meta-analysis that was done that kind of showed that monounsaturated didn't have as big of an effect as polyunsaturated as decreasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. That monounsaturated was still positive and saturated was negative, but polyunsaturated was kind of better in a dose response. But I think for the most part, if you're worried, use olive oil, use avocado.
What about the polyphenols in olive oil? There's some studies showing, like randomized controlled trials showing a beneficial effect just on cardiovascular disease with olive oil.
Yeah, I think olive oil specifically, there's some evidence that like it may have some unique benefits for cardiovascular disease and whatnot, and like metabolic health overall. So, but again, I kind of look at that and go, okay, well, it still has one double bond that can be oxidized. That can be, based on your mechanism for polyunsaturated, right? Like, shouldn't olive oil still be worse than saturated as well? And you can't, they never make that argument, or at least not that I've seen, So yeah, I think, again, we agree. I might agree for a different reason in that I don't know if I've seen enough to really, I think if you're heating and reheating, yes. Like once you get to the point where you're oxidizing those double bonds, now you're, who knows what's happening downstream of that. But I think it's probably, people who are eating a lot of heated and reheated oils are just eating really crappy foods overall. Like I'm not really worried about somebody who's, they spray their pan with canola oil and cook some eggs on it. I'm not worried about that. It's, the person eating fries that have been refried in the same oil over the course of time. But then again, it's like, all right, well, is it the oil or is it overall they're having a really poor quality overall diet? So I think for me, yes, I hold very much open the possibility that there could be some deleterious effects. But I think for most people, it's one of the reasons I say have guidelines, don't have rules, right? Because if you say things like, I don't eat seed oils, well, as a guideline, that might be okay because you're probably avoiding a lot of like ultra processed, hyper palatable foods, fried foods. But when you're like, cooking in a bunch of butter instead of like canola oil or olive oil or well, I guess not olive oil, but like you're kind of missing the point, And so I just want people to be a little bit more sane with how they handle this. Unfortunately, I think a lot of this boils down to there's a lot of conspiracy theories around all this kind of stuff. I've been told I've been paid off by big pharma, by big food, all name your list. I think at a fundamental level, people don't like the idea of responsibility, of personal responsibility in this. And it's much more palatable to kind of say, well, the food industry did this to us because they put all these things in our food supply and that's what made us all sick and, X, Y, Z. And there's all these, nefarious backroom deals being, I tend to think that most stuff is much more practical than that, which is food companies want you to eat more stuff because they make more money and their shareholders get more profits. And that's good for business. And so if tomorrow, people stood up and were like, we're not eating this processed junk anymore. And we want fresh fruits, vegetables, and that's all they bought. Guess what food companies would do? They would stop producing all that stuff, or they would focus on the other stuff, right? And so I think a lot of people like the idea of having this nefarious, evil, bad guy in the food world. And I think it kind of it feels nice for the ego because it takes that personal responsibility away, but then it's also very disempowering as well. And so what I'll tell people is I want to empower you that you can make change, and it doesn't have to be like these crazy diets. You can make some really small changes and have huge benefits just by, again, whatever gets you there, whatever decreases your energy, whether it's low carb, intermittent fasting, tracking your calories, omitting certain foods, fine. Whatever gets you there. But I just don't see some of these narratives being super helpful overall because it gets people focused on the wrong stuff. And it's just a very confusing overall narrative, right? Because you got, for every camp that says this thing is bad, there's another camp saying it's the best thing ever, right? And so people like to think they make decisions based on logic. Most people make decisions based on emotion. And most people, debate is actually a really poor, it doesn't really do much. There's a small sliver of people who will change their minds. And I go back to this very classic study in politics where they took a group of Democrats and a group of Republicans, and they showed both information that would either refute or support a pre-existing belief that they already held. Same thing for both groups. What they found was it didn't matter, Democrat, Republican, both things that like objectively refuted. Like here is the hard evidence. It shows that what you believe is wrong. That was just as effective as proof that they were right as reinforcing their personal beliefs. So I tell people when I debate this stuff online, I'm not doing it for the person I'm debating with. I have no doubt I'm not going to change their mind. I'm doing it for the small sliver of people who are open-minded enough to think, maybe I was wrong about my opinion. So I just think so much of this stuff, these tribal wars in nutrition, are so much based on emotion and kind of creating a bad guy to blame stuff on because we don't want to look in the mirror and see our own personal responsibility in the role of this. And I say this I'll give one more comparison and I'll let you ask me another question. The news. Everyone says, I hate the media. The media gets people spun up and it's stressful and all this. Yeah, but you watch it. You watch it. You know what? The media doesn't care if they put on good news or bad news. The only thing they care about is your eyeballs. That's all they care about. If every single person in the United States stood up tomorrow and said, I'm not watching this crap. I'm not watching negative news anymore. I promise you within 6 months, the entire news cycle would change because they don't care. They want your eyeballs. That's it. But we know negative news gets people more engaged because they got spun up, they get fired up, and emotion sells. And it's the same thing with health advice. I'm sure you've seen people who talk about things that are dangerous or things that will increase risk of death. That gets more attention than talking about the stuff that helps, right? And when you consider also why it's hard to talk to some of these diet tribes, people who have ingrained this as part of their, their personality, but also their beliefs. When you bring them evidence to the contrary, what you're actually doing is assaulting their belief about their own mortality. Because if you are right, then they might be actually killing themselves faster. And most humans would rather endure cognitive dissonance than believe, maybe I wasn't doing something that was good for me. I mean, God, we got people who will justify chain smoking or any other thing. The most people end up believing what they want to believe, what they wish to be true, regardless of the evidence.
Well, let's talk about the other thing you mentioned that is definitely a hot topic, which is the refined sugar.
Yeah.
And I know you've delved deeply into this topic. It's a lot of reading of, the evidence. It's something that you've talked about. I want to ask you if you view consuming refined sugar, particularly in the form of sugar-sweetened beverages, like something that's just liquid and sugar. If calories are the same, if people aren't over-consuming calories, do you think that's something that is still inert, not that harmful? Or do you think perhaps there's a reason to say, maybe we shouldn't drink sugar-sweetened beverage? I know you don't like to say that because then there's the whole psychology part, but there's diet sodas, right?
Yeah. So they're certainly not good for you. I think, first off, I want to be clear. We're probably talking about a subset of the population that's really small, right? In terms of, okay, they drink sugar-sweetened beverages but don't overconsume calories. That's very small. If we look at the meta-analyses of substitution studies where they look at, okay, sugar-sweetened beverages and we don't control for intake, absolutely increases fat mass, makes metabolic health worse. 100%, no question about it. If they look at studies where they substitute isocalorically, they don't really see a difference on sugar-sweetened beverages or fructose-containing beverages, I think was one of the meta-analyses I looked at, which I guess, could fall like fruit juices under that as well. So again...
Substitute with what?
So they're looking at isocaloric exchange. So in randomized control trials where they're having people either consuming, say, glucose versus a fructose-containing beverage.
But they're both sugar.
Right.
So what about not consuming, just consuming water?
Oh, okay. Good.
Water versus any sugar. It doesn't have to be glucose or fructose.
Okay. So if we look at sugars versus other form of carbohydrate. Okay. So substitution studies of other forms of carbohydrate.
Well, I'm talking about a specific type of sugar without a food matrix. Okay. Right? It's a liquid, 40 grams in a can. If you have 2 of those, it's 80, right? So I'm just saying like consuming a high sugar beverage with no food matrix, not substituting a carbohydrate food, because it's different.
Right. Again, and I believe one of the meta-analysis I sent was again, it's hard to get into it, but it was sugar-sweetened beverages when they control for calories. They don't see some of these deleterious effects on inflammation or body weight or whatever. But again, I think that's probably a really small percentage of the population because most people don't drink a Coke and go, well, that was 40 grams of sugar, so that means I'm not going to have a bowl of cereal. They're just drinking it on top of whatever their normal diet is, right? So it's a very, very small percentage of the population. Now, is it possible at a higher dose of, several cans of this stuff a day, could there be some uniquely deleterious effects? Sure. I hope we'll hold open that possibility. I think the issue is more so when you're consuming so much of it, whatever negative deleterious effects are probably lost in the wash of so much energy toxicity, right? Because you're getting so much negative effects from that. So yeah, I hold open the possibility it could be uniquely deleterious, but I would tell anybody, one of the first things I look for in people when we're working with them, it's like, all right, do you drink sugar-sweetened beverages? All right, let's cut those out, right? Now, when we come to, I know we've talked about artificially sweetened beverages because people will say, and here's where, again, messaging can have unintended consequences. People will say, well, you don't want to have artificial or diet sodas because they're just as bad as regular sodas. And they come up with a bunch of different mechanisms to try to validate that. No. Objectively not. Like in the human randomized control trials where they have people say either drink soda or use diet soda, very consistently people lose weight and actually a pretty good amount of weight. There was a year-long randomized control trial, I think, where people lost 7.5 kilograms just by substituting diet soda for regular soda. And when I do content on this, I'll get people all the time comment all I did was stop drinking regular soda and substitute in diet soda and I lost 50 pounds, right? Now, but usually the next thing that people say is, well, why don't they just drink water? Okay, again, I'm trying to meet people where they're at. Okay, some people have developed a habit, behavior, whatever it is, of drinking a soda. Water's great. If I can get them to drink water, fantastic. But you're going to have a hard time convincing me they're not better off being 15 pounds, 20 pounds, 50 pounds lighter by using diet soda compared to regular soda, right? And in several randomized control trials and meta-analyses now, where they compare substituting regular soda with either water or diet soda, they actually see diet soda produce more weight loss than water. Now, it's not because diet soda is a fat burner or anything like that. It's probably because people are seeking out that sweet taste somewhere else when they have water, right? They still lost weight with the water group. It wasn't a big difference between the water and diet soda group, but you can't really say, you can make all the arguments you want about brain signaling and whatever, but obviously it doesn't matter enough because these people are losing weight. And the other thing I've heard is, it causes an insulin response. Okay. There's several meta-analyses now to show that doesn't happen with any of the sweeteners that we know of. There was one study where they gave sucralose alone, sucralose plus carbohydrate, or carbohydrate alone, and saw sucralose plus carbohydrate caused a greater insulin response. But in my opinion, that study was not an appropriate control group because they were matching sweet taste between the sucralose plus carbohydrate group and the carbohydrate group. Because I think their primary measure was actually sweet taste in the brain, looking at that. And then this other stuff was secondary measures. So they did the right thing by trying to match taste or sweetness level. But the problem is, I think they used sucrose for the carbohydrate-only group, and they used maltodextrin for carbohydrate plus sucralose because maltodextrin is not as sweet as sucrose, but it has a much greater glycemic response than sucrose does. And so I don't think you can really say it's saying it's carbohydrate plus sucralose. No, it's maltodextrin plus sucralose. And so if we look at the meta-analyses, they just don't support any kind of insulin response. And what I would say is, okay, if you're getting a significant insulin response, why don't we have people just passing out left and right who are having diet sodas from hypoglycemia? Because if you're having increased insulin with no glucose coming in, your blood sugar is going to drop. Or the other explanation is, maybe if there is an increase in insulin, there must also be a corresponding increase in glucagon to offset that, which means all that stuff is going to be washed out since those two counteract each other. But again, there's no real data suggesting it increases insulin. And then the other thing that gets tossed around is the gut microbiome, which I am interested in. Most of the studies show no effect, but sucralose in particular does appear to have an impact on the gut microbiome. I have Suzanne Defcoda came out of the same lab that I did my Ph.D. in, and she's a microbiome expert. I've talked to a few other experts and looked at the research data. And my take was pretty similar to their take, which was, hey, we know the gut microbiome changes. We only have a rough idea of what a good, bad, or neutral change is. And for example, in one of the studies looking at sucralose, they actually saw an increase in the proportion of a bacteria, and I'll probably butcher the name, Blackodia cocoides, I want to say it is, something like that. You know how these Latin names are. But that species of bacteria is actually associated with better insulin sensitivity, less fat mass, and better overall blood glucose regulation. And so, okay, I can kind of make the argument that maybe sucralose has a positive effect on overall health based on that. Now, I don't know, and I'm not ready to say anything like that. My point being is we don't really know. Now, if you're worried, use something different than sucralose. I know you like stevia. There's aspartame is actually very safe. And people say, what about cancer? Okay, so here's the thing. Again, negative news selection bias. You're much more likely to hear about a study where something causes cancer than has no effect. How often do you hear a study of X showed no effect on cancer? I can't think of the last time I heard a study get propagated in the news about that. The null hypothesis just doesn't pop up that much. So 80% of the studies on aspartame show no effect on cancer. I think something like 11% are like a possibly, and 9% are a yes.
You're talking about animal studies?
But the ones it's all the ones that say yes are all the ones in animals at high doses, or, you have some of these cohort studies where it kind of like pops up here and there. But for me to feel confident of something with cohort data, I want to see it like really consistently. Like fiber, very confident that fiber is good for health, cardiovascular disease, cancer, mortality, because I am not aware of a single study looking at fiber intake in a cohort that did not show protective effects and in a dose response manner. So I'm pretty confident in that data. But if you look at, like, for example, aspartame in a study of you familiar with the Nutrisanté cohort? It's a 100,000 person study out of France from like probably 3, 4, 5 years ago. And I think I want to say it was a 20-year cohort. And one of the big headlines was aspartame increased the risk of cancer. So I went into the data and looked at it. So what the headline left out was from non-consumers of it to low moderate consumers, it increased cancer by, I think, a relative risk of like 15%, which was significant. And then the high consumers were not significantly increased risk of cancer. The high consumers were like a relative risk increase of like a non-statistical like 4 or 5%. I'm not aware of anything that's actually carcinogenic that is carcinogenic at a low level and then not at a high level.
No, that doesn't make any sense.
Right. And so I think, again, for me to be convinced by some of this stuff, it would need to be, it's just not consistent. And it's kind of like, I use this example too. Carnivores, now you're going to be happy. I'm going to make you more happy. I'm not convinced that red meat is an independent risk factor for cancer, because these studies are confounded by the fact that red meat typically is kind of a proxy for poor diet quality, because most people's sources of red meat in the American diet are fatty, they're processed. The studies looking at unprocessed red meat and cancer risk are all over the place. And when they control for diet quality, and there was a really, in my opinion, elegant study, a cohort out of Canada, and I think it was by a researcher named Maximova, I want to say. Maximova, Max something. And they looked at tertiles of unprocessed red meat intake and tertiles of fruit and vegetable intake. So you had, low, medium, and high of each. At low intakes of fruit and vegetables, red meat had a negative impact on cancer. At high intakes of fruits and vegetables and high intake of red meat, there was actually a protective effect of red meat on cancer. I think it was like a relative risk of 0.78, so like a 22% relative risk reduction. I can't remember if it was statistically different, but the point being, you're looking at overall diet quality. Because if you're eating a lot of unprocessed red meat and a lot of fruits and vegetables, you don't have much room for junk, right? So again, you don't see that stuff pop up consistently in the cohorts or in like the dose response that you would expect. And again, I've kind of had this debate with like more people more on the plant-based side who have said, well, shouldn't you, like, that's just showing that high fruit and vegetables can offset the negative effects of red meat. And I'm like, if something's an independent risk factor, it's going to raise the risk at every single level of everything else, right? So take LDL, for instance. Yes, if you have high HDL and low LDL and low inflammation, you have a lower risk than somebody who has high LDL and high inflammation and low HDL, right? But take inflammation. At low inflammation, high LDL with low inflammation still has a higher risk than low LDL at low inflammation. And at high inflammation, high LDL still increased risk above low LDL. At both those levels, that is when we determine something as an independent risk factor, because independent of everything else, it raises the risk. And we just don't see that. So again, coming back to aspartame, diet soda, wrapping this all together, I view diet soda as, you have to be careful, like people demonizing it, because what they think will happen, okay, well, people will just drink water. No, people will just keep drinking soda. And so why not give them this tool that appears to really be a pretty big lever for not much cost.
What about, okay, so non-nutritive sweeteners, there's definitely, there's the artificial sweeteners that you're talking about, the sucralose, the aspartame, saccharin, right? And there's the more natural ones, monk fruit, stevia. What I'm getting from you, and I just want to make sure it's clear, is that people that are consuming these sugar-sweetened beverages, if they substitute them with like a diet soda, which has aspartame, is that right?
Usually aspartame. Some have sucralose.
Okay.
They like acesulfame K as well, like that sort of thing.
Okay. Then it's clearly a benefit. Studies show it. They're losing weight. I mean,
getting more metabolically healthy.
More metabolically healthy. Let's talk about someone who doesn't drink sodas that are sugar sweetened, and they're lean, and they kind of just like, there's some people out there that like Diet Coke a day, not because they are getting off of their Coke habit, but because they like Diet Coke for whatever reason. Maybe it's the caffeine, maybe something about the taste. I don't know what it is, but those people exist.
Sure.
So Diet Coke a day, what is that? Do you feel confident that you talked a lot about the aspartame data, and it definitely seems a little bit all over the place. Cancer does take, of course, decades to occur, and there's a cumulative damage, and dose may matter, maybe one a day, but is there an uncertainty there that you might say, well, maybe we don't really know at the end of the day? Well, or do you feel like one a day is...
Well, now I'm going to get meta on you and say, I don't believe anything for certain.
Okay. All right.
But I have data I, bet my life on, bet my leg on, bet my foot on, bet my toe on,
Would you drink a Diet Coke a day?
I drink Diet Coke. Yeah.
You drink a Diet Coke a day and not feel like you're...
I wouldn't even feel...
increasing your mortality or cancer.
I don't present it to my kids. My kids drink water because that's what they ask for. But I wouldn't feel worried about them having one diet soda a day. I mean, if we look at, take aspartame, for example. By the way, I'm sure that comment's going to get me in trouble. If we take aspartame for nothing worse than parent shaming. We take aspartame, for example. I mean, we know what it's metabolized into. It's 2 amino acids, and it gets metabolized into phenylalanine and aspartate, and then methanol, whichever, right? Well, it's a very, very, the amount of diet soda you'd have to drink to get up to a level of methanol that would cause problems is you would die from electrolyte depletion first, right? From basically drowning yourself. And people say, what about bioaccumulation? Well, as far as I know, methanol doesn't really do that. There's a way to process it out of your body, unless you're consuming so much consistently that your body never starts getting rid of it. You like ethanol, there's a way to process it out of your body, unless you're exceeding your body's rate of capacity to eliminate it. So yeah, for those levels of diet soda, I'm just not worried about it. I mean, again, one thing my professor really hammered home into my head is you can never be certain about anything. So when people say there's proof, I don't think you're speaking scientifically, because you can never really prove something in science. You can support hypotheses with data. You can disprove stuff. You can have some things that there's so much overwhelming data, we just accept it as true. But, we have had things that we have held very closely to, we thought were true, that ended up we were slightly off. Or, I will say most of my things that I ended up changing my mind on, I never planted my flags super strong about it. Even with protein distribution, even though I was a big protein distribution guy, I never said, if you're not distributing your protein well, you can't make gains. I never said something like that. And so I think actually that was one of the major issues with COVID and the distrust in science is supposed to be a very behind the curtain thing, right? Us scientists debate about stuff, we do studies, and 30 years after that, we come to a consensus and we go, we think this, right? And instead, everybody got to see the scientific process play out in real life, which was, well, this study says this, and this study says this, and well, that control wasn't appropriate, well, this here. And we were trying to sail the ship while we were trying to build the ship, And I said right at the start, I said 20 years from now, I'll be able to look back and say, we should have done this. But we couldn't. And unfortunately, it's led to this really pervasive distrust in science. In fact, whenever I get into, presenting people with evidence, what they end up defaulting to is, well, I just don't trust science because it's just be faked. It just be bought, I'm like, do studies get faked? Sure. That's much less that happens than just poor design and or designs or p-hacking or designs that are designed in such a way that it looks like you're testing two things, but you're not going to actually see a difference, So very rarely, and I tell people this, almost without fail, when I see a study where the headline is something I don't agree with or is contrary to what I think the evidence says, when I go in and read the methods and I read the results, 99.9% of the time I go, oh, I see why they found what they found, right? And you have to remember, conclusions from studies are just an author's opinion. And you kind of alluded to this earlier, but people ask me, they kind of accuse me of like being in an ivory tower. Like, well, do you really need a Ph.D. to read research studies? And I'm like, no, I guess you could figure it out. But I tell you what, you might as well go get a Ph.D. by the time you had enough experience to actually do it well, because it is very difficult if you don't have the experience to understand these studies and the practical limitations of them as well. And I'll give you one more example. There was a study done looking at resistance training. It was in a certain circuit, and I knew the researcher, right? And he's giving this presentation. And it was a certain order of exercises. And I said, hey, Chad, why did you guys do them in that order? Is there something special about that? And he goes, oh, no, it was a 10 by 10 room. It was the only way we could get two people in at the same time by doing that order. So you realize like scientific studies are so limited. They are big, blunt instruments. And that's why I just don't get excited about like a couple studies anymore. I wait till there's a lot, because I always hold open the idea that I could be wrong on some of this stuff, but again, I tell people I don't plant my flag real strong usually. And if I do, you probably should pay attention, because I used to believe, again, that diet sodas were bad for you. I used to believe that. I used to believe that LDL cholesterol wasn't a risk factor for heart disease. I used to believe that intermittent fasting was, bad for muscle, that like you wouldn't be able to build much muscle. I've changed my opinion on all of these things, because I just saw enough data. But again, I was never super strong, my flag on the front end. It was more like, I don't think LDL is a risk factor because of this, but it wasn't the LDL is actually good for you and you should try to pump those numbers up. But I think people just fall into such black and white thinking. Like
the carnivore diet. I definitely want to talk to you about that. You talked about it a little bit. It's kind of like the seed oil thing, where it's like you've taken it head on.
Yeah.
And I like talking about it. I really want to talk about it with you because I don't think people can accuse you as the anti-meat guy, clearly.
I get accused of it. I get it from both sides. Vegans and carnivores hate me. Not all vegans.
Well, that's ridiculous.
Rational vegans like me.
There's clearly a lot of people that experience benefits from going on a carnivore diet, an all-meat diet. I also hear them say things like plants are bad for you. You mentioned that. Fiber is bad for you.
It's toilet paper.
Interesting. I'm trying to figure out where that's coming from. But, what's your take on it? Like in terms of, why are they're experiencing the benefits? You kind of talked a little bit about it. Why they're experiencing some of these benefits. Like autoimmune disease is a big one, right? Their autoimmune issues kind of resolved. But like long term, for some people, yeah. But long term, do we have even data on this? No, there's no data. So there's a lot of belief in this based on how you feel, I guess, or perhaps some biomarkers. But, plants are bad for you, fiber's bad for you. Like, what's your take? Clearly there's something going on. People are experiencing things that are real.
So I'm big on symmetrical application of logic. If you were going to use a certain line of logic, you have to apply it symmetrically. You can't just apply it asymmetrically, but asymmetrical application is usually what people do. What I mean by that is, let's take the plants are toxic thing, right? There are people out there who will say, well, broccoli has this compound in it, which is a carcinogen. I think I saw some physician, doctor saying there's 76 known carcinogens in plants. And I'm like, if you extracted like the chemical composition out and like overfed them in high doses, maybe. Okay. But what actually happens when people eat plants? Like if plants are trying to kill us, they're doing a really crappy job. Like they are failing miserably because people who eat more plants tend to live longer. And so, okay, why are we not applying that towards compounds in meat? Heterocyclic amines, heme iron, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, NUE5GC. And when you bring that, they go, Carnivore, I was debating, well, that's just hormesis. I'm like, well, how convenient that the compounds that might be carcinogenic are hormetic for the stuff you like, but the stuff you don't like to eat is toxic. I'm like, but this is like the Olympic level mental gymnastics they have to do to convince themselves. Because again, they believe that they're actually doing something healthy for themselves. Now, I want to be very clear. Some people do carnivore and they get healthier. I'm not saying that can't happen. I am simply saying you would be even more healthy if you also included fiber in that, if you also included fruits and vegetables. Now, I think a lot of these people are people with undiagnosed IBS, people with gut issues, digestive issues, and what is carnivore? It is an elimination diet. And so what happens when people who have gut and autoimmune disorders go on elimination diets? A lot of times they feel better. Okay, but an elimination diet is meant so that you can then add back things and see what you tolerate versus not tolerate. Many people, FODMAP sensitivities. Many people have FODMAP sensitivities, aren't even aware of it. So they cut out fruits and vegetables, which can be high in FODMAPs, and they feel better. Okay, so then start adding them in one by one and see what you tolerate. And I think the other thing to point out is there is a lot of selection bias that goes on here, which is if you look at these carnivore groups, because I've been in them, because I watch, they're really people who are getting positive benefits are the ones that are the loudest. And the people who don't, they get like gaslit, bullied. They get accused of like sneaking in carbohydrates or plants. And the response is always, well, just add more fats, add more animal fats, if they're having problems with constipation or whatever it is. And it's funny, I was on a debate with Paul Saladino on Mark Bell's podcast years ago. And I think I actually came across poorly on that podcast because, one, I wasn't super familiar with his entire position. And I was so flabbergasted by it. It took me like an hour to just recover and like get my wits back about me. And he pulled up his postulation at the time was fiber is toilet paper. Your body doesn't digest it. Like, why would you put that in you? Well, fiber isn't just like toilet paper. Like there's this thing called soluble fermentable fiber that actually is the main fuel for the gut microbiome. And of all the things we know that actually help with the gut microbiome, that's like the biggest lever is fermentable, soluble fiber. And that produces things like butyrate, propionate, which have positive metabolic health benefits in many randomized control trials. So that's one. But he pulls out this study that I'd never heard of before. And it was a study where people who had constipation eliminated fiber, and a lot of them reported improvement in their symptoms. So it's self-reported and there's no control group. I'm like, okay, but the meta-analyses show overall that fiber helps with like going to the bathroom with pooping. Like it helps. Okay, maybe some people feel better by eliminating it, right? Okay, I can see a place for that. But again, it's not that carnivore has this magic. It's that you're taking things out of your diet that were probably aggravating you. They were aggravating your digestion, producing excess gas. You're having pain, bloating. And again, this is another one where people go, I was very inflamed. I'm like, yeah, what was your CRP? What was it? What's that? I'm like, well, that's what you use to measure inflammation. Well, my gut hurt. I was bloated. No. That is localized inflammation in response to something going on there. That is not the same thing as the inflammation that raises the risk of heart disease and cancer and that sort of thing. So what I would say to people is, hey, if you want to eat like a meat-based diet, I still don't think it's a great idea, but like you don't have to have like 4 ribeyes a day. You can choose leaner cuts of meat. You can have fish, and why not work in some fruits and vegetables? And if you have digestive problems with those, add them in one at a time and see which one doesn't give you digestive distress. And I think, unfortunately, this becomes so much like a religion for people because they just, I think a lot of them don't like eating vegetables. And so it becomes an excuse to not eat vegetables. We believe what we want to believe. And again, the asymmetrical application of logic is very interesting to me. So there's a lot of carnivore advocates out there that say epidemiology is garbage. In fact, Paul Saladino had a video titled "Epidemiology is Garbage." Like, okay. And then when he was on another podcast, he was citing epidemiology. And I'm like, wait. So epidemiology is garbage unless it's epidemiology that you agree with. But he's not alone in that. There's a lot of people who did that. And then here comes this internet survey that was published by Harvard about people. I think it was in Harvard, but it was like a self-reported internet survey of people reporting certain things improving on carnivore diet. I'm like, wait, so 20-year cohort studies with appropriate covariates are garbage, but a self-reported internet survey, that's high-quality evidence. Okay. I mean, again, it's like if you're going to apply a certain type of logic, you have to be consistent with that. And again, what I'll say is, hey, I just laid out how I don't think red meat is an independent risk factor for cancer. I'm not convinced about that. I'm very unconvinced about that. But if red meat had the data that dietary fiber had about reducing the risk of cancer, heart disease, and mortality, you carnivores would lose your absolute minds if anybody dared suggest that it wasn't good for you. And so it just very clearly points out the asymmetrical application of logic. And getting more into dietary fiber, it fulfills almost every single aspect of what I need to be considered strong evidence, which is we know the mechanisms, in terms of insoluble fiber, decreases gut transit time, decreases the risk of diverticulitis, which probably is a risk factor for developing colon cancer at some point. There's some idea that by having less gut transit time, that the toxins that are in our digesta that wind up in stool, that they have less time to interact with those intestinal cells. And so by getting rid of it faster, that reduces your risk of colorectal cancer. Soluble fiber, the effects on the gut microbiome, the production of short-chain fatty acids, and also the lowering of LDL cholesterol. So we have an improvement in glucose metabolism and insulin sensitivity. We have those mechanisms.
Not to mention the micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, and
that are co-ingested along with that
in those plants and fruits. Yeah,
in the food matrix. And actually, what's interesting is one of the first seminars I went to as a graduate student, there was a professor there talking about lycopene in tomatoes and all this kind of stuff. And at the end, we're asking questions, and he goes, "You know what? You have a really hard time beating Mother Nature's kitchen." And I really like what he said, which is, whenever we try to extract these individual compounds out of food, rarely do we see the same beneficial effects as consuming the whole food itself. To your point about the food matrix, right? So yeah, there's a pathway there. There's biochemical pathways there. We may not ever be able to really pick them out in terms of priority of but the thing to remember, and I tell this to people, every food you eat probably activates something positive and negative. The question is not whether there are things in it that will activate positive and negative pathways. And even that I get the heebie-jeebies about because, a pathway is probably only negative if it's dysregulated because your body evolved to keep you alive. But it can activate good and bad things. The question is, what is the overall outcome of that, right? Like we said, aspirin activates procoagulant, anticoagulant pathways, but the overall effect is anticoagulation. Plants, fruits and vegetables. So any food may activate positive and negative pathways, but the question is what's the overall effect, right? Because if we try to tease apart every individual biochemical pathway, it's going to be really hard to wrap that back together. And again, with fiber, there's also a dose response. We see a dose response in these cohort studies. And again, if we do a forest plot of studies showing benefit or showing harm, literally every single study is on the side of benefit. So I just don't know how much more data you need. Just because some sources of fiber might make your tummy hurt doesn't mean fiber is bad for you. I don't know how more else I can lay that out, you know?
I 100% agree that there's just an overwhelming amount of evidence that fiber is beneficial. Plants, vegetables, fruits, beneficial. There's randomized controlled trials. There's the observational data. I mean, you can't ignore that.
And I don't even like eating vegetables either. I just do it because I know it's good for me.
Okay, we're running out of time. I do. There's another topic I want to cover. I also want to ask you about personal routine, but the topic is something that you and I have probably butted heads with a little bit, at least on social media in the past years ago. I don't know that it's been recent, and that has to do with time restricted eating.
Okay.
And a form of intermittent fasting. So my question to you is, well, first of all, I want to say this. Over the years, my view of certain benefits of what I think of time-restricted eating has changed as more data has come in, and specifically referring to the fact that there are studies out there that have calculated if people are just in their free living environment and they're naturally doing time-restricted eating, and they actually are doing it, they do decrease their calorie intake.
Correct.
Between 200 to 500, depending on how short of a time window they're eating their food. And so if you don't consider the calories that they are restricting, the weight loss benefits seem to go away when you then consider the calories. So in other words, if they aren't restricting calories, the time restricted effect on weight loss seems to go away.
That's correct.
Now, so I didn't always believe that, but as more data came out, I now say, okay, well, this seems to be real for sure. There are a lot of types of time-restricted eating. Sure. There's like 6-hour window you're eating in, 8-hour window. There's even 10 hours, which I don't think you're going to get a big difference if you're comparing 10 to 12. But other effects of time-restricted eating, do you think, there is a circadian component to time-restricted eating, right? There is a circadian component. You are eating, humans are diurnal creatures. We're eating within our time window when our circadian rhythm is more metabolically inclined to process glucose and fatty acids and everything, right? Do you think there is a possibility of a benefit of time-restricted eating, like independent of calories?
I think there's a possibility, but I think based on the research I've seen, if it does exist, it's probably pretty small. You do, in some studies, I actually posted about this, I think, yesterday. You do, in some studies, see some of the more transient markers have an effect with especially early time restricted eating versus continuous feeding. But you don't, at least to my knowledge, I haven't really seen one that shows a difference in HbA1c or HOMA-IR, those sorts of things. What you tend to see is fasting blood glucose, fasting insulin, maybe a little bit lower in the early time restricted eating, which I think it's possible. It's possible that is a real effect. It is. I think it's also possible that, if they're early time restricted eating and they finish eating at 1 p.m. and they're not eating until 8 a.m. the next day when they're doing a blood draw, whereas the person who is just regular eating, eats right before bed, gets a blood draw the next day, I think it's possible that might explain that small difference. Now, I could be wrong, and so there could be a small extra benefit to it.
Blood pressure. Have you seen the blood pressure one?
I haven't seen the blood pressure one.
That's the 6-hour, I think it was Verde from Chicago. Blood pressure was that, again, calories were equated, so there was no weight loss.
Yeah.
There was the fasting blood glucose, but the blood pressure was the thing that was most interesting to me because it was side effects that you get with antihypertensive treatment drugs, which was very interesting. And so that's something, there's, again, you're getting into the potential cardiometabolic effects. There needs to be more research, but I just wanted to see if you are, what your stance is.
And I think, again, that would be one where I'm I'd like to see how the timing of the measurement affects it, right? So what I would like to see is somebody do a study just like that, but when they do their final blood draw and blood pressure, they do the same length fasted from the day before, right? So that you're equating that fasting period before those things. Because, again, I think, blood pressure responds relatively acutely to a lot of different things. Stress, if you just ate, you'll have a higher blood pressure due to solutes in your blood. So, I think it's possible. and I hold open that possibility, I think what I tell people is like, practically, it's probably very little difference. And so I look at practically, is this something that you can implement in your life and make a lifestyle? And if the answer is yes, by all means, it's a great tool, right? Like it's a great tool. It's one of your only levers. The levers you have are dietary restriction, like low carb, low fat, plant-based, whatever. Calorie tracking restriction, right? Where you're tracking stuff. Or time restriction. Those are your 3 levers you can really pull in terms of if you want to put things into buckets, right? And you can combine them if you want to. But whatever gets you consistent, that is the biggest thing. And so for some people, they love time restricted eating. You know, I've had people say like, hey, I eat in this 8-hour window, 6-hour window. I don't feel hungry. I'm good. And so I think where people, the messaging can get confusing again is like people say, well, there's some evidence that early time restricted eating is better. Okay, but what happens if somebody is like not being adherent to that because they get hungry at night and then they end up binging at night because I already screwed up my feeding window. Might as well just have whatever I want, right? And so I think the messaging, it's important to understand why these things work, right? And so we would both agree, okay, if there's a benefit, it's probably small. And the biggest lever is making sure you're just being consistently, controlling that calorie intake. And so the benefit of time restricted eating is for many people, they don't have to track and they'll limit their calories that way. But I have met people who they use time restricted eating as basically an excuse to binge eat during their feeding window. And for them, that's not going to work very well, right? And so the other thing that gets brought up a lot is kind of, autophagy and then longevity. And so what I'll say is, yes, time restricted eating raises autophagy, but so does calorie restriction. And so does exercise.
Yeah, all true.
And also with autophagy, I think, again, this is where it's like using terms as blanket good, bad. I mean, autophagy is elevated in some cancers. It's elevated in some wasting diseases. I mean, we were talking about lysosomal protein degradation, essentially. And so, I just try to remind people, like, thinking about stuff in black and white is probably not the way you want to do it, right? Now, I think the issue with trying to understand something like autophagy is really you'd have to almost do studies looking at autophagy where you're equating like weekly calories, like if you want to get into more extreme versions of fasting, and then looking, okay, what is the overall net effect? Because, all right, let's say you're doing alternate day fasting, right? Like a more extreme version of fasting. Absolutely, I have no doubt that on your day of fasting, your autophagy is going up. But then if we are equating calories, right, you're going to be eating much more on your feeding day than a person who's just eating the same amount of calories every single day is, if we're equating apples to apples, right? And so when you're eating more, that tends to reduce autophagy. And so what's the overall net effect, right? I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I would suspect, based on other things I've seen, that it's probably going to be really no difference, that it is a tool to control calories, and that was what affects autophagy. On longevity, I mean, really, there's some animal studies. There's some in vitro stuff as well. I think, and even the calorie restriction stuff, I think I have a kind of a unique take on this because I've done animal research. So there's nothing I'm aware. I mean, there's a couple rodent studies looking at time-restricted eating where they suggested a longevity benefit. I think rodent model is probably a poor model for longevity because rodents grow throughout the course of their life. Humans kind of peak at like around 20 and then they kind of stay level. I mean, obesity notwithstanding, and then they start to decline later in life. Very different growth curve from rodents. Now, rodents are good models for other things like protein metabolism, decent model for glucose metabolism, but for longevity, I'm not convinced. Now, if we look at the monkey study, the primate studies, we see the calorie restriction effects on primates, right? And so I think, but I'm not even convinced it's calorie restriction. And here's why. Because I know how these studies are done. Because when you're looking at lab animals, you just look at what they normally eat, and then you cut 20, 30% out, and you go, that's calorie restriction. But I've pulled up these studies and looked at the charts of these animals' weights. They don't keep dropping. There's maybe a little drop, and then it just kind of plateaus, right? They don't really lose much weight, if at all. Animals tend to overeat in captivity. And when you look at the odds ratios of what obesity does for longevity, what I think is happening and what I think you're seeing is these animals just don't become obese. And and they don't gain excessive amounts of body fat. And so calorie restriction, it's probably better put as it's just like preventing excess body fat, right? Because, I mean, if you take that at face value, I mean, if you're truly in a calorie deficit, you'll die. Eventually you'll die, right? So I think a lot of this can be boiled down to just don't become obese. Don't have excess body fat. And you don't have to be super lean either. Like actually the mortality data suggests if you're super lean, that's probably not good either. There's some aspects of that I tend to think that people who are very lean are probably extreme in other ways. And those aspects of their life probably contribute to the mortality rate. But like 15, 20% body fat, if you're a male, appears to be, a very protective effect for mortality compared to being, 30, 40% body fat. And so again, I am very convinced that excess body fat is really bad for metabolic health, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and mortality. But how you get to a normal body weight or lean body weight, I think is way less important than actually just getting there.
Got it. I think a lot of people are interested in what Layne's weekly routine is, like in terms of your, the workout, your diet, supplement. Is there like a supplement that is, in the fitness industry you think is like a no-brainer, like people should be taking?
Yeah.
So I'd love to kind of end with your personal routine.
Yeah, and full disclaimer, I own a supplement company, Outward Nutrition, and so I have some bias here, but I feel I tell people I don't put anything in it that I wasn't using beforehand and felt pretty strong about. So routine-wise, it does vary because I travel a lot for things like this, and I have my kids week on, week off because I share split custody. And so weeks I have the kids, it's summer now, so it's a little bit different, but usually I'm up early, getting them ready for school, taking them to school, get back. Workday starts around 8:30. Usually, I'll wake up. If I'm taking the kids to school, I'll just pound a protein shake or something like that, just so I get some protein in, hold me over, take them to school, get back, have some caffeine, whether it's coffee, energy drink, whatever. Which, by the way, caffeine is the original nootropic cognitive enhancer. Pretty consistent data on that. And then I'll start work, whether it's emails, recording content, reading research. A lot of my time as I look on social media for what people are talking about and see if it's something I want to talk about. I handle all my own social media, so that is a lot of what I do on a day-to-day basis, posting. I like to read the comments to see what people are talking about, other questions they have. And then usually I'll have lunch and then I'll go train in the afternoon, and that will last 3 hours, depending on I've got world championships coming up in 11 weeks in South Africa. And so, my training time per week is 12 to 15 hours. It's a lot of time. And so I'll usually, on weeks I have the kids, I try to train Monday through Friday and then take the weekends off so that I can just spend the time with the kids on the weekend.
Is there a reason you train in the afternoon? Is it?
I just feel better.
Okay.
I just feel better. And usually if I haven't had great sleep, if I have some time to kind of wake up, I go better. But if I go early in the morning, I just notice that my performance isn't as good. And I like getting a few meals in before I go train. So, and then once I finish training, I'll get back. I have a nanny who helps me with the kids. So she, I take the kids to school, but then she picks them up. My son is on the spectrum. He's ASD. And so she takes him to ABA therapy. And then she'll pick my daughter up. She'll do homework with her, and she'll do tutoring and whatnot. And then both kids will come back to my house at 5 o'clock, which is about the time where I've finished training and finished all my work. And then I'm dad for the evening, right? And then once they go to bed, I might, any emails I got to fire out or something like that. But mostly I'm just unwinding. I'll watch the sunset. I'll watch a TV show, whatever, right? Weeks I don't have the kids is usually if I travel, that's when I travel. Still try to train in the afternoon. But obviously it can be kind of wonky depending on how things go. And pardon me. On weeks I don't have the kids, if I'm in Tampa, usually I'm working a little bit longer in terms of I'll wake up a little bit later. I try not to wake up too much later because I don't want to get off. I've just noticed that being consistent at the time I wake up actually helps a lot, even if I get less sleep. But I'll wake up, I'll start work after breakfast. I'll get most of the way through my work, go train, get home, have dinner, watch a sunset. Then I'll go do some more work and then usually like finish up the night watching a TV show or playing a video game or just something to like deplug my mind.
What kind of meals do you eat? I mean, is it protein?
Honestly, I usually batch cook protein, so I'll cook a lot of chicken breast up just so I have quick, easy, accessible protein because carbs and fats are pretty easy, you know. But sources that you would expect, you know, for proteins, chicken breast, Greek yogurt, lean red meat, lean pork, fish, eggs, those sorts of sources of protein. For carbohydrates, again, what you'd expect, fruits and vegetables, rice, oatmeal. One of my favorites is I love popcorn. That's like my treat because it actually is very high in fiber. People don't realize, especially if you air pop it, or there are some brands who actually are really high in fiber and not super high in fat. I love that. So I'll have that. It's a great way to get in 10 grams of fiber. And it takes you a long time to eat it, so it's very satiating as well. And then I actually do use quite a few frozen meals. Again, I don't let the enemy of good be perfection because, I mean, if I spend all my time cooking, it's just, or I'm hiring like a personal chef, I mean, that's a lot of expense. And so I do use some frozen meals that are higher in protein, higher in fiber. And usually at night, I'll have like a small bowl of ice cream or maybe a cookie or something like that. And that's like my little treat that I enjoy. Sometimes before training, if I'm like kind of rushing, I might have like some gummy bears or something like that just to give me some quick glucose. So I make sure that I've got something in circulation. But for the most part, my diet's about what you'd expect. Supplement wise, I mean, if I had to build my Mount Rushmore of supplements, it is very clearly 3 supplements. It is creatine monohydrate, caffeine, whey protein. The amount of research data on all 3 of those is enormous. And honestly, especially for creatine, I just can't see an argument at this point not to take it because of the cognitive benefits. There appears to be benefits on memory formation, even short term. There was a study that just came out showing like 30 plus grams of creatine at a sitting actually acutely increased memory formation, which I was very surprised by. Depression. There was a study that showed that creatine helped a little bit with the symptoms of depression. Again, cognition, possibly cognitive decline. And then, of course, all the lean mass, strength benefits, performance benefits that we talk about. And it's very, very safe. I mean, if you take creatine, you might see your creatinine levels go up. It doesn't mean your kidneys are failing or anything like that. Again, there's so many long randomized control trials looking directly at kidney function, showing that creatine does not negatively impact kidney function. The one thing that I hear pop up consistently now is, well, it causes hair loss. No. One study in 2009 showed that it increased DHT, which is a metabolite of testosterone. It didn't show any changes in the precursor or the thing that comes after DHT. And so how is this happening, right? Like, where is this happening? I mean, it must be directly affecting the enzyme that catalyzes the conversion if we believe this, right? But again, even if it was true, an increase in DHT is not the same thing as showing hair loss, right? You're showing a surrogate marker, you're showing a mechanism. And it's never been replicated. And again, to me, a suspect mechanism because you're not seeing either the precursor or whatever, came after, I forget what comes after DHT. You're not seeing a difference in those. And so how is this effect happening?
And more importantly, hair loss wasn't measured.
They didn't measure hair loss, yeah. And so I tell people, I'm like, I'm just not worried about it. Again, it was 15 years ago. I would think by now, if it was a legit thing, it would have come back. So that's like my tier 1 of supplements.
What kind of dose for the creatine?
5 grams a day, plenty for people. 3 grams for small women, probably enough.
Do you think is the water gain?
So the water is all intracellular. It doesn't increase extracellular water. People who feel bloated on creatine can be a gut irritant for some people. So what I recommend is splitting the dose and taking it morning and night if you find it's a gut irritant. But it doesn't increase like extracellular water. All the water that we see, it does increase total body water and intracellular water, which is a good thing. That actually makes you visually look better. Like if you're full with glycogen, for example, your muscles look better. There's a reason bodybuilders load carbohydrates before a competition, because you look more volumized, your muscles look fuller. So creatine, whey protein, I just take as needed to get my total protein intake. I don't think it's anything magical about whey protein. I think it's just a very high quality, tasty, relatively inexpensive way to get in high quality protein.
People are worried about an insulin response from protein powder. Are you like...
Again, this is where it's important to have guidelines, not rules, right? Okay, well, let's look at the randomized control trials. Okay, yeah, it does seem to have an insulin response. It does. But does insulin sensitivity get worse? No. If anything in the studies, it gets better. So again, I'm not worried about an acute insulin rise, right? One of the things I'll tell people is if we're going to worry about acute changes and stuff, you're not going to be able to eat anything. Because fat impedes flow-mediated dilation after a meal. Carbohydrates raise blood glucose, which is, blood glucose is toxic over time. And protein stimulates mTOR, which is involved in, formation of cancer in some cancers. Big difference between acute rises in these systems versus like long-term dysregulated signaling. Big difference. Then my tier 2 of supplements would be things like, I really like Rhodiola rosea as a cognitive enhancer, as an adaptogen. It improves time to fatigue and improves perception of fatigue, and it appears to be pretty consistent.
Mental fatigue?
Yeah, so like even in exercise, like their perception of fatigue. But yes, it also, I think it's task completion is how they measured it. I could get that wrong, so if any experts are out there and want to correct me, please do.
What dose? I recently got interested in this, in Rhodiola rosea, and I ordered it, and I have it.
Yeah.
And it was because of the potential mental effects. So
depends on the standardization of the cylindricides, the roseavins and the cylindricides. I think it's like you want like 3%, but the dose that's usually used for most people is like anywhere from I think like 100 to 600 milligrams. But if you go above that, they actually show like it actually starts to fall off. So there appears to be like an optimal curve. So like in our pre-workout, I believe we have 150 milligrams. And so, or maybe 150 milligrams per scoop. I have to go back and look. But it's an amount that's kind of like right in that middle range to get the benefits. And anecdotally, I find it takes the edge off caffeine too. So like you don't have as much of a come down off caffeine. So I like that. Ashwagandha, I'm very bullish on ashwagandha. There's a few meta-analyses now showing improved lean mass, improved strength, improved sleep, better stress management. There's been some worries about like, I think liver, some people said, or also like depression and mood. I haven't seen it pop up in any of the randomized control trials. And so I don't really, it's not something I worry about. That seems to be another adaptogen that kind of like helps really with stress management. And interestingly, it raises testosterone too, but not an amount that it doesn't raise the testosterone or lower cortisol enough to where it explains the changes in lean mass. So this could be like a matrix thing again, where there's like acting on multiple pathways summing up to an outcome. Now, I am a little bit, it's in our recovery product, but it's tier 2 because I just want to see more studies over a longer period of time. Like if you look at creatine, caffeine, whey protein, there are thousands of placebo-controlled trials showing the benefits to this across multiple labs over decades in different countries. Very strong evidence. I just want to see more from things like ashwagandha, rhodiola over a longer period of time before I would move that into a tier 1, right? And the mechanism isn't really understood yet of ashwagandha. And so I just want to see that fleshed out a little bit more, right? And then there's things like betaine or trimethylglycine, which may improve power output during exercise. You have things like beta-alanine, which if you're exercising like intense between 30 seconds and 10 minutes, that appears to have some benefits. Citrulline may have some benefits, and at least if you're getting in like 6 grams. in terms of like fatigue resistance. So those are some like, and then fish oil, melatonin, those things would kind of go into my tier 2. Actually, melatonin has shown an increase in lean mass as well. There's some studies now, randomized control trials showing an increase in lean mass. So some people might say it's improved sleep is improving lean mass, but there's actually some evidence that it may act outside of the improved sleep. I'm not sure the exact mechanism. So again, I want to see more of that.
It's a hormone. I mean, it changes 500 different genes.
Right. So those would kind of be my tier 2. I'm sure I'm missing some stuff, multivitamin probably go in there somewhere,
Insurance.
Yeah. I mean, just make sure you're covering your bases, right? If you have a real hard time eating vegetables, always tell people fruits and vegetables, whole foods are better. But if you need a fiber supplement, okay, fiber supplement, you could take Metamucil and Benefiber. So you're getting soluble, insoluble, Again, I think it's better to get a diverse array, but let's not let perfection be the enemy of good, right? So if you need a fiber supplement, by all means. So those would kind of be like the things that I'm having and stuff. And that's, the supplements I sell. We sell a sleep supplement. There's other things in there. There's like a few other ingredients that have been shown to improve sleep, but melatonin is the big hammer in there. And then there's a recovery supplement, which has creatine, it has ashwagandha, it has betaine, so some of the stuff I'm talking about. And then
what do you think of glucosamine and the
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably in a tier 2 if you want. I think the evidence is, I haven't looked into it super specifically. I think there's good evidence that it does a little bit is what I would tell people. It's a small effect, but it seems to have an effect.
So if you're throwing the kitchen sink, I mean.
Yeah, if you want to do that, that's fine. And other things that fall into like, people are like, what's tier 3? I'm like, tier 3 is where there's just not a lot of consistency in the data, right? Or you got stuff like, ectosterone, which there's a couple studies out there that show, hey, an increase in lean mass and ectosterone. And I'm like, it doesn't stimulate protein synthesis, doesn't do anything to protein degradation. Where is this increase in lean mass coming from, right? So that HMB, probably something in tier 3, where like in specific populations, there might be a benefit, but for most people it does nothing. So that's kind of how I categorize my supplements. But I really we only have 4 supplements in my entire line. We have a pre-workout, we have a recovery, we have sleep, and we have whey protein. And our whole deal, we're probably going to come up with an electrolyte supplement as well. But our whole deal is basically like, the line is not going to do the work for you. You got to do the work, which is why we call it outwork. And we're just going to help you be able to train a little bit harder, recover a little bit faster, but it's your training that's going to move the needle.
Totally. Well, I mean, and you're going to help them get the information. People can find you. You have a YouTube channel, social media, book. You want to call out everything. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people already know where to find you, but for those few that don't.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you can find me on Instagram as BioLayne. That's kind of my digital business card, and I'm on most platforms as BioLayne. But yeah, I mean, I do everything. So, we have one-on-one coaching. If people are looking for that, we do coaching through Team BioLayne, which is a team of kind of like experts that I've handpicked to be one-on-one coaches. We've trained them in our methods. If you want to be a better coach, or you want to learn how to do this stuff, want to learn methods and don't want to go back to school, I have an academy called Physique Coaching Academy with Professor Bill Campbell, where it really is like, it's over 600 pages of written material. But if you want to learn how to be the best coach to help people build muscle and lose fat, body composition, we synergize resistance training, nutrition, supplementation, and cardiovascular exercise around all that. And there's not really anything else out there that does that right now. So there's that. Then, for people who can't afford one-on-one coaching, we developed my app Carbon Diet Coach, which is $10 a month. And I basically wrote a algorithm that will essentially coach you, like do accountability coaching. So if you're doing fat loss, you weigh in, each day. We tell people the more data points it has, the better. You weigh in each day, and based on how you progress, the app will adjust your nutrition recommendations to make sure that you're going towards your goals. And it will even give you some feedback messages, like when you check in and whatnot, to tell you what you're doing well or what you can improve on. So that's been really successful for us. A lot of people like that because obviously not everybody can afford one-on-one coaching, but this thing does everything that MyFitnessPal does, except it actually like gives you feedback week to week, and it adjusts your nutrition as you progress. So it's a great option for people who can't afford one-on-one coaching. And then my supplement line, Outwork Nutrition, got a couple of self-published books. And then I also have a research review called Reps, where myself and my team of writers, we pick out 5 studies that are in like fitness and nutrition every month. And we break them down in like a really practical way. There's some really good research reviews out there, but I found most of them were still like too highbrow. I really wanted to get something that was very, very practical. So Reps is research explained with practical summaries. And so that's a great tool for people at $12.99 a month to like if you're confused about some of this research, we'll break it down for you, And then I also have what's called a workout builder on my website, which is where people can go in and get, kind of semi-customized programming for like $12.99 a month as well. So I really try to like from top to bottom, like build out stuff to help people at every different level of their fitness journey.
A lot of options there for someone, for anyone.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I got a lot of stuff going on. I tell people, I'm like, I tell you one thing, I ain't boring.
Yeah. Well, that's for sure. I absolutely enjoyed having a conversation with you, Layne. It's too bad that it had to be cut a little bit short. We could keep going for another couple hours, but I think that means we have to do this again. I would love to because
anytime.
Yeah. And again, thanks again for coming on, for everything you do. And I look forward to continuing following you and seeing what's up. And again, possibly around you soon. That'd be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun to be able to do this stuff.
Awesome.